to End Colonialism, a Mission for All Youth. Thank you very much to our translators. Thank you very much to people who are cooperating with us around the world and to our audience members around the world. And thank you to our contributors from the first panel. Please go back and watch it. And if you haven't seen it, it's very good. Today, I'm convening our second panel here. We have, it's about 1:30 now. We will go until a 3 o'clock Q&A session, and then we'll conclude at 4. And I am very honored to introduce to you the keynote speaker for this second panel, and that is US Senate candidate Diane Seymour.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I have to say we are in the moment that I thought was going to happen about 3 weeks after I met Lyndon LaRouche in 1987 or 88, which is the total blowout of the transatlantic financial system. So it is a completely rich political situation, while it is not rich for people who thought they were rich. And if you know what I'm referring to in part, this is only a symptom. The actual breakdown has been occurring since 1971, when Nixon made the fateful decision under pressure from the British and George Shultz to decouple the dollar from the gold reserve system and end the Bretton Woods system, which unleashed however many years, 55 years of insane delusion where people have become confused, where they think that money and financial instruments measure economic growth as opposed to the actual measure of everything in the universe, which is man. And I mean mankind. And that is a very controversial point today that was attacked for generations to ensure that you could keep a world divided, as Helga said earlier, with the elite and everyone else like animals. Your status is determined by your bloodline or your social stand or whatever arbitrary other matter, as opposed to understanding that there is something completely unique about human beings, which gives us the possibility of participating in the creation of the universe, which isn't finished, and we have a lot to do with. So what's happened? Well, people have probably heard you had Silicon Valley Bank, 16th, 18th largest bank and has gone under. The depositors will supposedly be able to get their FDI and FDIC insured deposits on Monday, and then people who didn't have FDIC or had over the amount, I don't know how they're going to deal with that. Then we had another bank, Silvergate Bank in San Diego, which had the first one, Silicon Valley, had about 200 billion plus in assets at the end of 2022. Silvergate had only 14 billion, a billion here, a billion there, only 14 billion. For most of us in this room, that's not that much, right? And then this bank in New York, Signature Bank, which was at about $119 billion. So I wanted to share with you something that Lyndon LaRouche wrote in 2014, as usual, way ahead of his time, but extremely important for how we're going to solve this. And the reason I wanted to start by saying the system is finished is because there is a difference between having an identity as a slave or a victim in which you participate in your own oppression, and an identity of what everyone is, which is a human being, who has, by nature of being human, the ability to completely transform the past, the present, and the future. And the way that you transform the past is because what you create in the future changes the relationship between the past and the present. Now, What LaRouche wrote was called Not an Option, an Immediate Necessity. This is from June of 2014. He writes, the economy of the United States of America and that of the transatlantic political economic regions of the planet are now under the immediate mortal danger of general physical economic chain reaction breakdown of that region of the planet as a whole. The name for that direct breakdown crisis throughout the indicated regions of the planet is the presently ongoing introduction of general bail-in action of several or more governments. For people who may not know, we had bailouts where the government prints money and bails out companies, but then you had bail-in where the banks say that they can liquidate your savings to save the banks, like what happened in Cyprus a few years ago, where they converted people's savings into bank stocks. And then they said, oh, the bank stock has dropped by 90%. So here you go, you can have 10% of what you thought that you had. Not very different. And then he talks about the available remedies. One thing I also want to say here, because we've been living in this fiction dominated by a financial delusion thing, way or the other. You have all these people who studied economics who say, well, lowering the interest rates causes hyperinflation. Raising the interest rates is how we're going to slow down an overheated economy. Now, how many people here have experienced an overheated economy? Are you doing? I mean, I don't know, maybe the price of eggs be fine. No. So, and what does raising the interest rates do? Well, it just tanked 3 banks. But besides that, what does it do? It means your small business loan, your mortgage, whatever it is, you have to pay more. So how is that not inflationary? The only way to address the question of inflation is you have to increase production. You have to increase physical production, and you have to increase those things that improve the standard of living of what? Of the human being, which, as I said, is the measure of progress, nothing else. And it's not only life expectancy and infant mortality, but it's a question of how many people can be sustained at a high standard of living in a given land area. But let me go through what LaRouche says, because what we actually are going to have to do is create a movement of people who are qualified to lead and organize the recovery. And my fear is that we don't have enough people who are thinking in that domain. We have too many people who are still clinging to straws. How can I personally survive? Can I avoid being foreclosed upon? Can you get this guy to get his foot off my head? Whereas that system is over. And the question is, how do we organize the new system? And will we have enough of a conception of the actual, how should human beings live on this planet? What is, do you think about how New York City looks to people who visit from other countries. Someone who has been in Beijing, someone who has been in Moscow, and they will tell you, you have all this garbage on the streets. I see bags of, and it stinks and it sits there for weeks or days. It's there for hours. What is this? And you have people pushing each other into subway trains, and you have no regard for the potential of the people who need care, because we have no mission in this country. So we are throwing millions of people on the scrap heap, whether it's our overbloated prison system, where we still have the highest number of people in prison per capita of any country on the planet, whether it's our mental health system, which is non-existent, or our education system, where we have decided that children are just to be turned into automatons for the sale and pleasure of perverse people, to later become debt slaves when they pay $1 zillion to go to school, and then they can be like the aphid that is milked by the ant. So we're in a situation where everything is wrong. Just about everything is wrong. And if you try to solve it by saying, well, we have to fix this, or we have to fix this, or I get as a candidate, well, what is your policy for X? Do you think we should have charter schools or no? Forget it. Either we move into a new paradigm, a new way of thinking, which happily the United States Constitution and Alexander Hamilton had some glimmer of, or we're done, really. So I want to share with you what LaRouche said had to be done. Four steps. Number one, the immediate reinstatement of the Glass-Steagall Act. Why is that so important? And Glass-Steagall, for people who don't know, is the separation of the banks, the legitimate commercial functioning versus investment functioning. It was repealed in 1999, I think, under Clinton, Alan Greenspan, et cetera. And it made it legal when we had the crash of 2008 for them to make the commercial banks swallow up things like Countrywide, and then they could use your savings account as collateral for their future gambling. So the reason why we need to put Glass-Steagall back in effect is we need to put the whole banking system through bankruptcy reorganization. And that's what happened under FDR, where you're going to have to go through the books and you're going to have to say, this is garbage, this is garbage, this is garbage, we're not going to pay it, this is legitimate, this is an actual debt, okay, we'll restructure it, we'll save it, maybe someone's mortgage has to be reorganized, we're going to have to bail out the pension funds. You put the system through bankruptcy, the stock market crashes, what are you going to do about the pension funds? You're going to have to save, you're going to have to bail out certain things. How do you know what to bail out? What does human life depend on? That's what you bail out. And the other garbage you let go. So Glass-Steagall, first and foremost. Second, a return to a system of top-down and thoroughly defined national banking. That is no Federal Reserve, no private bunch of jerks who meet in exclusive places deciding behind closed doors what they do with the credit of the United States. National bank. Now, I know many people say, oh, you can't have a national bank because you can't trust the government. Well, guess what? If you can't trust the government, we're done. We better get a government we can trust, which is why these interventions are so important. Why do we have a government that we can't trust? Because everyone's been sitting on their rear end complaining about it and not doing anything to address it. So you have to make a government that you can trust. We have it in our Constitution. And the people can tell their representative, if you have a national bank, you can decide who gets the credit. Should we have a national rail grid? I don't know. We have 2.5 train derailments per day in the United States. Is that a problem? Well, I think so. We now have, and I would like to get the figures, but apparently our farmers and other people, because the rail system is so overloaded and so inefficient since they're all going off the tracks, people cannot, there are perishable items like food for livestock and livestock that have to move in a specific time frame. And if it doesn't get there, it doesn't work. You can't have it. It just doesn't work. So we have to have a national bank and credit system, which is point 3, is credit to generate, as LaRouche puts it, high productivity trends in the improvements of employment with the accompanying intention to increase physical economic activity. And so what does this mean? This means to increase man's power over nature. That is a good thing. Explicitly, it means, and it will lead us to the 4th point, energy flux density. How is it you can sustain in a given area of land potentially X number of people? Well, if we were to all go back to burning wood, how much land would it take to sustain a family, especially in a place like New York where it gets cold in the winter? And if you then figured out how to use coal or petroleum, or you developed a steam engine, somebody makes a discovery And then if you have a society which is designed in such a way that the discovery of the individual genius can be assimilated, the whole society moves up to the next platform. For example, take FDR and the Rural Electrification Administration. Now, Wall Street totally opposed this. Why? Because they said, how can you spend all that money to copper wire 40 miles to some farmhouse? That's a waste. We can have we can have copper wire in the city, everyone's close together, but it is not worth the money to send we don't want everyone to have electricity. They don't need it. Well, happily, FDR prevailed. Happily, we had Pecora Commission hearings and a bunch of Wall Street bankers went to jail and they lost their ability to dictate policy. And what happened when everybody had electricity? Well, all of a sudden you had refrigeration. All of a sudden your chickens would lay more eggs because you could have control light, which controlled the egg laying cycles. All of a sudden people had washing machines and guess what? Then someone had to make the washing machines and the dryers. So what happened is when you had a platform where suddenly everyone had electricity, the entire economy moved to that level. Now, here's the question. Do you think we have discovered everything about energy now? Are we done? But that's what you would think from what they teach, right? Oh, the world is going to run out of raw materials. Stop consuming, lower your carbon footprint. We have too many people. No, that's very arrogant, because that's the assumption that somehow we have already discovered every universal principle. Now, obviously we haven't, because we've got the Webb telescope out there finding all these galaxies and planets that might sustain human life, but they're 3 million light years away. Well, doesn't that bother you? I mean, it seems to me that we should figure out how to get there. And I don't know the principle, but there has to be something beyond what we know. Or was Einstein the last word on it? And do we have to travel in the form that we think? So the fourth point of LaRouche's 4 laws is adopt a fusion driver crash program, because ultimately we have to have very, very efficient forms of energy that use very, very little fuel, that give you an enormous amount of power, and you can do things to totally transform your environment. We should be greening the deserts of every continent. There should be no place on this planet, Helga already said, where there is not clean drinking water and adequate nutrition. But the question is, how do we get there? And the last thing I wanted to say is that this is it's a real challenge. And LaRouche used to say to us, when you go to war, when you go to war, I'll just put it that way, against an enemy, against an evil policy, the first enemy you have to deal with is within. And all of us can reflect on that. What stops you from doing what is right in the time that it needs to be done? What are the things that block you from being as effective as you might be? Because if we don't solve these problems internally, then we're not going to find ourselves prepared for the moment that confronts us now, which is an amazing moment, because all of the people who have been so powerful don't have that power anymore. They've lost control of the situation. Now, they may go to thermonuclear war, that's the danger, but they've lost control. And the question is, what are we proposing? Happily, you have a whole new paradigm coming into existence, in no small part due to the work of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche over 40 and 50 years. But we have a job to do inside here, the United States and Western Europe, in the very barbaric, backward Western world. And there are just a couple of things that I want to bring up on the battle. One, carbon dioxide causing climate change. That is a myth. That's not to say there's not pollution, but why is that? To stop the development of energy and to keep nations in poverty. And we have to become rigorous about how you know whether something is true. And if you're going to assert it, you should be able to demonstrate that it is true. Carbon dioxide doesn't cause climate change. It is not a warming gas. It's not to say there's not pollution. It's not to say we shouldn't get beyond combustion. It's frankly absurd that we've been a century using combustion engines, but that is a major inhibitor to the kind of economic development we need. The other is that we have in the West a culture of addiction. And it's everything. It's literal, like drugs. And I mean every kind of drug, not everything that everyone thinks is harmless. Legal, illegal, prescribed, not prescribed. We also have an addiction to behavior modification through our phones and our tablets. And it is taken for granted that everything is based on manipulating someone's behavior or opinion. And it's just worth reflecting on it, or even reflecting on yourself. All of us, I know personally how much my concentration has been damaged by this god-awful phone, because you get disrupted, or you go to look something up online and then, and immediately you're off track and you're not doing what you should be doing, and you waste hours and hours and hours and hours. And we're going to have to think through this and develop a determination to not be distracted from making the kinds of discoveries that we have to make. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Sorry, the final thing I'll say, because I've been reading the autobiography of Helen Keller. And when you read what this woman did, deaf and blind, from 19 months until her teacher came to her when she was 7 years old, and she had no way of getting outside of herself because she couldn't communicate in any way and people couldn't communicate with her. And the idea of language, from the first word that was spelled into her hand associated with a doll, to being able to write letters within months, to learning Latin, Greek, German, writing poems that rhyme, and you see that, then you realize the incredible potential that has been squandered by do or should be able to do, or what we ourselves should be able to do. So that's what I would like to say. We have a lot of work to do. We have an enormous amount to learn. If you're like me, most of us probably feel that we are woefully underprepared and unprepared for this moment, but it is the moment and we have to seize it.
Thank you very much, Diane Sayre. I would like to show Simon Miller's presentation next, and so that's going to be lined up technically. And let me give you a little bit of preview of how we'll continue, because we had to change the order of things a little bit. After Simon, we'll hear from Liam Murphy on Africa. After, we'll play a short video from our movement in Yemen. And this is actually recorded before the trilateral statement from China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. But I'm sure we'll have more dialogue with them in the future on that point. So that's what we have immediately coming up. So the next video is by young member of our movement, Simon Miller, and I leave it to him.
In the almost 10 years since President Xi Jinping announced China's Belt and Road Initiative, and in the decades of discovery and planning prior, economic development has formed the basis of a growing bond between all of its member nations. It is stated in the introduction to the 1997 EIR Special Report, the Eurasian Land Bridge, that it is in Eurasia that most of world history happened, and this is also the arena where the fate of humanity will be decided. In one corner of this arena stands NATO, the City of London and the Western financiers, all eager to isolate each nation in Eurasia, preventing development for the purposes of carving them up and devouring them. In the other corner of this arena stands the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, BRICS, and all those living in Eurasia who wish to avoid this economic stagnation and plunder by developing strong relationships amongst themselves. It is no surprise to anyone that this battle, ongoing in the grand Eurasian arena, has only grown more intense as time passes. And for every successful victory of economic development, there has arisen another challenge, ranging from the vast Western sanctions regime to the continued eastward march of NATO. Oftentimes, however, these Western reactions to Eurasian development have had an opposite effect to that which was intended. Rather than crippling their economy and preventing development, the massive sanctions imposed on Russia since 2014 have served to increase cooperation between Russia and her economic allies, leading to huge infrastructure and energy investments along the forming Eurasian land bridge. An example of this can be found in the Russia section of the 2017 Schiller Institute report, The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge, Volume 2, whereas it is explained that President Putin visited China in May 2014, just weeks after the Ukraine coup and the imposition of Western sanctions on Russia, and there he agreed to one of the biggest energy deals in history. The report then outlines the scale and impact of the $400 billion deal that they signed, all spurred on by Western sanctions. The same can be said for the newest wave of sanctions, those that came in response to Russia launching their special military operation in Ukraine. The destructive nature of Western financial policy abroad has in co-op that Belgium and the Eurasian Economic Union represent, and it has further solidified existing cooperative efforts. One such existing effort, the Great Stone Industrial Park near Minsk, Belarus, has been called the Pearl of the Great Silk Road by President Xi Jinping due to its central location within Eurasia and its rapidly expanding productive capabilities in various fields not limited to pharmaceuticals, heavy machinery, and automotive parts. Planning for a joint venture between China and Belarus began in 2010, using the Suzhou Industrial Park in Singapore as a model, and construction at Great Stone began in 2015. By 2018, the 8 resident businesses that operated there paid $17 million in annual taxes and created 5,000 new manufacturing jobs in Belarus, according to China's Ministry of Commerce. Since then, the number of resident businesses has exploded from 8 in 2018 to over 100 in 2023, creating thousands more jobs and expanding the already overwhelming economic benefits. To put that into perspective, it took roughly 5 years of development to attract 8 resident businesses to Great Stone, and then it took just another 5 years to attract the next 90 plus. The businesses at Great Stone now produce a wide variety of high-tech and innovative products that get easily distributed throughout Eurasia. Businesses from around the world are incentivized to invest in Great Stone because of their unrivaled access to efficient infrastructure through integration with the Belt and Road Initiative. On February 15th, 2023, an agreement was signed by Belarusian and Russian leaders to unify the industrial policy of the two nations in an effort to substitute imports lost by Western sanctions. And on the 28th of February, President Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus invited China to join. Let's start with Belarus, and then the three of us, Russia, Belarus, and China, will unite. The bridgehead is good and it is profitable. Therefore, the Great Stone truly has a great future. Many of the resident businesses at Great Stone are Russian, and what Lukashenko suggests is a unification of the industrial policies of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Eurasian Economic Union through the focal point of the Great Stone Industrial Park. In this way, Great Stone could become only a crucial center of power in the grand Eurasian arena, but it could also serve as a model to other nations in Eurasia who may be looking to integrate with the World Land Bridge in the near future. Belarus can act as the bridgehead to unify the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of which Belarus is an observer seeking full membership and Russia is a full member, and the Eurasian Economic Union, which comprises much of the former USSR, including, of course, Russia and Belarus. Just recently, on March 9th, Belarusian Foreign Minister Sergei Alinik reinforced this by commenting that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is one of the pillars of a multipolar world, and it is important for Belarus to become a full member of the organization. The minister then outlines the extensive benefits that full membership in the SCO will garner, including deeper economic, political, and diplomatic cooperation with other Shanghai Cooperation Organization members, which comprise half the global population. We can achieve a greater understanding of the truly massive potential of further integration with the SCO by looking at a March 2022 Schiller Institute policy proposal titled The LaRouche Plan for a New International Economic Architecture. The proposal has a chart breaking down the share of global physical economy, which comes from just 3 countries, Russia, China, and India, nations that form the backbone of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and 38% of the world's population together. The numbers are staggering. 65% of the world's coal, 66% of the world's steel, and 55% of the world's electrified rail. I can go on. 16% of the world's oil and 23% of its natural gas, as well as 45% of all the new nuclear production. It is obvious to any observer why Belarus and various other nations are pursuing deeper ties with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and thus joining its member nations in fighting for peace and development in the grand Eurasian arena. This battle cannot just be won with increased investment or economic ties. It will also take massive political and diplomatic cooperation within Eurasia and abroad to build up an entirely new economic and diplomatic architecture through which common development can replace the endless war and austerity. This is the future promised by the Belt and Road Initiative, by the World Land Bridge, and by the new paradigm. The reality is that cooperating with this new paradigm benefits not only countries in Eurasia, but people across the entire planet. If we, the minority in the transatlantic region who understand this dynamic, complete our mission, even those countries that are now in the grand Eurasian arena, like the US and Britain, will join hands with Eurasia and the rest of the world to pursue global cooperation on the basis of the paradigm that is now coming into existence. We are truly on the precipice of sweeping changes in the nature of the global economy and society. And in Belarus, only a few miles outside of Minsk, is the pearl of the Great Silk Road, the Great Stone Industrial Park, which will soon become just one of many pearls which line the economic corridors of a unified Eurasia. I stand with the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and BRICS as they build the foundations upon which we may develop the future of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you. And Simon, I believe, has fixed his technical problem, so he should be on Zoom for the Q&A period. So we'll be hearing from Liam, and then we'll have a video from our friends in Yemen, then we'll go to Kainan. So I'm really happy to introduce Liam Murphy, a member of the LaRouche Youth Movement. Please give him a round of applause.
Hello, everyone. How are you doing today? Are you enjoying yourself? Good, good. Okay, so the question I want to focus on today is the question of if a post-colonial world is possible and what are the possibilities that exist within a post-colonial world, specifically in the frame of what is possible in Africa. I'll take it. Okay. So I want to ask the crowd that first. Do you believe that a post-colonial world is actually possible today?
Yes.
Yes. No. Okay. Yes. Well, there's a lot of people who don't think it's possible. And I want to say that I think that not only is it possible, but in many ways, we are actually already here. But the problem is And the question that we need to ask is if we are ready to accept the new paradigm, and if we are actually ready for mankind. It's already here. It's just a question of if the United States is going to accept it. I want to start off actually with an FDR quote that I found particularly interesting. And this is actually a quotation from a conversation that FDR's son captured when he was speaking with Churchill. So this is the quote. Let me find it. Wealth. Imperialists don't know what wealth is. They don't realize what they can do, what we can create. They've robbed, referring to the African continent, of billions, and all because they were too short-sighted to understand that their billions were pennies compared to the possibilities that must include a better life for the people that inhabit that. And that is the possibility that exists today. And that is the possibility that the United States must wake up to, is the new paradigm and the opportunities to turn the billions that we've stolen into a far bigger thing that benefits us. And so I want to kind of compare and contrast that the paradigm that is developing and that I think is already largely here versus the old paradigm of the so-called rules-based order. And by doing that, I want to very quickly look at what occurred in Libya around 10 years ago. Libya was one of the wealthiest countries, in Africa, if not the wealthiest. They had free healthcare, free education, free electricity, and they were working on the Great Man-Made River Project, which is one of the most fascinating mega projects in world history. It was the largest water project in history, and they did a lot to green the desert regions and bring all this fresh water to hundreds of thousands of people. And what was the reaction of the Western forces to this paradigm and to the fact that they were developing a new currency and these new opportunities? Well, the disgusting thing that many of us, I'm sure, have seen is when days after Gaddafi was assassinated, we see Hillary Clinton go on the news and say, "We came, we saw, he died." And what a disgusting reflection on the resistance to development that we see coming out of the United States. I want to quickly compare that and that attitude that you see from Hillary Rodham Clinton to the views that are demonstrated by Xi Jinping in speeches that he's given on African Chinese development. So he says, the achievement of inclusive and sustainable development in Africa hinges on industrialization, which holds the key to creating jobs, eradicating poverty, and improving living standards. He continues, China is ready to share without any reservation advanced applicable technology and to combine Chinese competitive industry with African needs for development to deepen industrial cooperation. So, I want to ask, when was the last time you heard of a Chinese country invading an African country? The Chinese invading an African country. When was the last time you heard of the United States sharing its advanced technology with an African nation? So this is the paradox of the competing paradigms that we are seeing today. So I think that it's clear that the era of colonialization is over with the projects that we're seeing actually develop out of the Belt and Road. So for instance, I recently wrote this article about the East African crude oil pipeline. So this is a huge mega project that is being developed in Uganda, Tanzania. Me and Dewey also have been working on some follow-ups to that article. But the gist of it is that it's an oil pipeline that begins in Lake Albert in Uganda. And it's the world's largest heated crude oil pipeline because it goes all the way from there, which Uganda is landlocked, and it cuts across in through Tanzania and to the port where it'll be able to be exported. Now, the crucial thing to realize about Uganda and Africa is the situation of energy poverty that exists within these countries. So I pulled up some statistics. The United States per capita, per kilowatt hour per capita is around 12,000 kilowatt hours per capita. And then when you look at Chad, it's a mere 8 kilowatt hours. So that disparity that exists today, it's frightening. When you imagine that, and you have these people who are forced to go out and chop down trees and have wood to heat their homes, to cook their food. And that is a struggle that they go through every day. Now you see the Chinese have worked out deals with Uganda to work together with them on developing their oil and gas industry, on developing the East African crude oil pipelines, which also include fiber optic cables and other infrastructure is included with this pipeline project. And you see that the Chinese National Offshore Oil Company has a 28% stake in this project. The Chinese University of Petroleum has also made a deal with Makerere University, who we have contacts with, such as Raman and Tongo, to have a scholarship program to send Ugandans to the university, as well as an exchange program where the Chinese and the African citizens can intermix and go to each other's universities and learn. And they're also funding a state-of-the-art laboratory being made in Kampala in Uganda so that there could be a furtherance of the scientific developments and in the geology industry and petroleum industry. So you see that development happening today that China is all involved in, but you see from the West, there's been a dramatic push against actually this pipeline project. And you see these Western NGOs, Fridays for Future, Friends of the Earth, all these different environmental groups pushing back against this project because they say that it's a climate bomb. Now, of course, they didn't call the Nord Stream attack a climate bomb, even though it was the largest release of methane gas in all of history. But you see that they want to go into Africa and tell them, hey, you can't build this pipeline because it's so bad for the climate. But by the way, go cut those trees over there so that you can heat your home. So we see this kind of ridiculous hypocrisy. By the way, those NGOs, when you look into it, where do they get their money from? Where do they get their funding from? Oh, we're only, the Open Society Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, all of these foundations, some of them which actually got their start and their money and their family from the oil industry. And now they want to say that, oh, no one else is allowed to actually develop these resources. You have to wait for a just transition for us to give you the money to build the solar panels and windmills. So you see that kind of hypocrisy. And then you see other projects that are developing along the Belt and Road. For instance, one that is particularly interesting because it actually has a past to it that extends all the way to the 1970s. And this was very early in Chinese-African together, their cooperative history. China actually worked together with Tanzania and Zambia to build a railway that extended from the port along the Tanzanian coastline all the way into Zambia, which is completely landlocked, so that there could be an economic development corridor there where goods are actually exchanged and traded and moved from place to place to be manufactured into finished products. So you see these developments actually occurring when now that railway, which was built in the 70s, is now being invested into transform into a more modern standard gauge, higher speed railway system. And there's example across the continent over and over again of the Chinese actually working together with these different African nations to build the type of infrastructure that lifts people out of poverty. We might give a little bit of what we call aid money to build, to give people mosquito nets. To stop mosquitoes from eating on people. But what about actually, I don't know, building the infrastructure so that people aren't exposed to mosquitoes in the first place? What about building the type of infrastructure that actually leads these people out of a life of poverty so they could maybe make mosquito nets there in their country? I mean, we're treating these people like second-class citizens, like dogs, and then we're supposed to be so good because we give them a little bit of aid. So it's disgusting, that kind of thing that we see, and the potential now, because of the Belt and Road Initiative, for future products, for future developments and future projects is absolutely astounding. So the Three Gorges Dam, it was built, it's the largest dam in the world. It was built by Power China. They actually recently signed an agreement, a memorandum of understanding, to where they're going to consider what will be necessary for the Trans-Aqua project, which is a project that the LaRouche organization had a very huge influence on discussing as a possibility. So Lake Chad, it's almost completely dry today. We have many such cases also in the United States of lakes drying up. So the Trans-Aqua project was a project in mind to actually refill the lake and create all of these new opportunities for different river routes to extend trade and extend commercial cooperation between these different nations within Africa. That is a project that right now actually has a chance of being created. And you see the company that built the Three Gorges Dam is actually looking into actually building this continental-wide project. You see with energy, you see that the energy part, the oil and gas industry is being developed in many of these nations. But what's more exciting is the potential for nuclear. So you're having these agreements to study and begin training young African students on nuclear energy science and development. So the basis for a complete shift in the paradigm, for a complete shift in the way humankind interacts with each other, the way we work with each other, is there, and it's happening right now. The only thing stopping it is that we are resisting it. So it's time that stops, and I want to say that Africa has a very unique role, not only to play in the future, but also to create this paradigm, because you see what Lula called for in Brazil, where he called for a non-aligned nation. African nations But I think that these countries should demand an investigation into the Nord Stream pipeline attack that Seymour Hersh exposed, because, for instance, with the ECOP pipeline, how can the West work together on actually building new projects with these other countries if these countries don't even think that they could trust us? Helga Zepp-LaRouche a couple of weeks ago was recently on a show with what was the name of the Russian TV guy? Solovia. And it was it's been crazy to see how outside of the United States, most of the world thinks that every single person in the United States, no one sees that we're falling into the nuclear war. You know, no one sees that there's this actual opportunity for a new paradigm. They think that everyone hates Russia, hates China, and is just completely stupid. And that's what the exciting thing is about us and the LaRouche organization, the interventions that we've been doing, is that we're showing the world, look, there actually is a voice in the West. There actually are people in the West who understand what is necessary for humanity to continue and survive. And we're interested in working together on building these projects. And I just got to say, you know, there's the America First movement. You know, everyone talks about, well, why are we going to work around the world? You know, we need to retreat back to the United States. There's nothing here anymore, folks. I mean, we're not going to be able to rebuild America if we don't work together with other countries. It's not going to happen. The only industry we have left practically is the military industrial complex. So how are we going to get ourselves out of this mess? We have to be the voice of reason to say that We need to work with other countries. If we don't work with other countries, the worst possible scenario is obviously nuclear war. The best possible scenario is that, you know, without actually joining this new paradigm, is that we're just going to have a hyperinflationary blowout and we're going to be the laughing stock of the entire planet. And as a patriot, I don't want that to happen. So it's time that we join the new paradigm. We join the new post-colonial world that is emerging today. And without that, we're done. So thank you. That's all I got.
Thank you very much, Liam. Thank you. Please give your attention to a wonderful young man in Yemen, Musa al-Raini. I'm sorry, Musa Ali al-Raini.
From Sana'a, happy capital of Yemen, when Yemen was the center and meeting place of old caravan roads. Today, we dream of the youth of Yemen to restore this happiness with the ideas and minds of the 21st century, and with the arms of the economic army by the youth. Let me introduce myself. I am Musa Ali al-Raini, a member of the BRICS Youth Parliament. I am 16 years old, and I will move to the third year of high school a month from now. I'm delighted to participate in front of the La Roche Youth Organization in the presence of the spirit of legend Lyndon La Roche, and headed by Mrs. Helga La Roche, that lights our way today in the night and darkness of conspiracy and aggression in the path in Yemen. I'm pleased to record here our special greetings to Her Excellency on the occasion of the well-known International Women's Day on March 8th. I myself, in the BRICS Youth Parliament, I have to take and invest this occasion to talk to you and express our everlasting happiness and care of attention of the 10 principles that are announced by Mrs. Liga La Roche towards the development, security, investment, and structure. These 10 principles must be as a map of the life road for youth around the world, as a map of great hope, a map of cheerful life, not only a lifeblood, but a life schedule for generations and planets. The importance of these points are not realized by countries and nations, since the exorbitant costs of civilizations and humans will be more costly than the hardships of today. We have in the BRICS Youth, as well as the BRICS children's classes, taken earlier reading the 10 principles from the moment of their announcement. Here, you can see a matrix in Arabic and English. We base its understanding and explanation to others on the 5 keys of La Roche to the progress of the BRICS countries, which are in your report from the new Silk Road to the World Land Bridge, and in our Yemeni report, the Happy Economic Miracle. We build up with the Western culture of aristocratic and virtuosity that took our right to childhood and our right to dream of the next youth phase. Due to that, we paid a high price until the dawn of La Roche emerged in Yemen. And today, Yemen has become more independent despite the aggression on it. So Yemen now has chosen its development path that's linked to its history, civilization, and Islamic specialism. And today, met the dream for one humanity that the matrix and 10 principles of Mrs. Helga La Roche crosses. Yes to development, and all that evil is the lack of development. Thank you all, and the best success for the outcomes of your great conference and meeting.
Thank you, Musa. Okay. The next speaker just turned 21 this week, so please give a round of applause for Kynan Thistlethwaite. And a happy birthday.
Could you just lower it a little bit, Daniel? I'm still taller than you. Thank you. Daniel actually wanted me to present something on poetry, so I'm delivering my remarks upon that. So I just want to discuss the principle, which has been very much developed by the Schiller Institute and specifically by Helga herself. And we've termed that principle the nemesis principle. What does that mean? So in Greek mythology, Nemesis was Zeus's messenger of justice, the goddess of divine retribution. She appeared chiefly as the avenger of crime and punisher of hubris, and she deeply disliked any absence of humility, and that provoked her, to establish order, harmony, through punishing those excesses, that pride and that undeserved happiness. Now, if you go back to the great empires of history, the Roman Empire, Babylonian, Byzantine, that they've all collapsed. Why? Because they brought about their own destruction through the very axioms that each nation had adopted. They could not sustain themselves except by looting their people, waging wars on other nations, and through primitive accumulation. Think about our own country today. And, there's a quote from Shakespeare's Hamlet: "For murder, though it have no tongue, it will speak." And one of the great poets to demonstrate this principle, a poet from whom this organization receives our name, is Friedrich Schiller, the great poet of freedom in Germany. And he demonstrated this principle in a poem, The Cranes of Ibycus. And just briefly on the poem, it tells the story of a poet named Ibycus, who's incredibly talented, but he's brutally murdered by another group of poets out of spite for his skill and talent. And then later in the poem, a flock of cranes then fly over Ibycus's body, and he tells them, "If there is no one else to avenge my murder, I call upon you, cranes, to be my vengeance." And then eventually, later in the poem, there's a group of rhapsodes and poets that gather for a contest. And then suddenly you have a group of Furies that enter. And now the Furies, if you don't know, they represent Nemesis. And they're the deities of divine justice and divine vengeance in Greek mythology. And then once they appeared, the poem has this very eerie and haunting tone, it's a lot clearer in the original German than it is in the English. But unfortunately for all of you, I don't speak any German. But the Furies tell the group of poets, "We will haunt the guilty until he falls. Even if he goes to the next world, we will not stop there. We will catch him and bring about his downfall." And that is Nemesis casting its fury upon the murderers. And I'll now recite, or I should say I'll attempt to recite the end of the poem, which is quite long, but I think everyone here should read it. It's very worth it. So I'll start. This starts with the Furies. This is them speaking. "He's blessed who, free from guilt and falling and failing, the child's pure spirit is preserving. We may not be near him vengingly. He wanders on life's pathway free. Yet woeful, woeful him who hidden hath done the deed of murder base. Upon his very souls we fasten, the black of night's most dreadful race. And hopes he to escape by fleeing, on wings were there, our nets ensnaring around his flying feet we throw, that he is to the ground brought low. So tiring never, him we follow, repentance ne'er can us appease. Him on and on onto the shadow, and give him even there no ease. So singing, are they roundly dancing, and silence like the hush of dying lies o'er the whole house heavily, as if had neared the deity. And solemnly, in the custom aged, the theater thus strolling round, with footsteps lingering engaged, they vanished in the hinterground. And twixt deceit and truth still hovers each hesitating breast, and quivers and homage pays to that dread might, that judging watches hid from sight, inscrutably and fathomlessly. The darksome coil of fate entwines, proclaims what's in the heart so deeply, yet runs where the sunlight shines. Then hears one from the highest footing, a voice which suddenly is crying, see there, Timotheus, behold the cranes of Ibycus. And suddenly the sky is darkening, and o'er the theater away, one sees, within a blackish swarming, a host of cranes passed on its way. Of Ibycus, that name beloved, each breast with new grief bath affected, as waves on waves in oceans rise, from mouth to mouth it quickly flies. Of Ibycus, whom we are mourning, who by a murderer's hand was slain. What is't with him? What is his meaning? And what is it with this flock of crane? And louder still the questions growing, with lightning strikes it flies foreboding through every heart. 'Tis clear as light, 'tis the Eumenides' great might. The poet's vengeance is now granted. The murderer hath self-confessed. Be him who spoke the word arrested, and him to whom it was addressed. But scarce the word had him departed. Fain had he in his breast it guarded. In vain. The mouth with horror while white brings consciousness of guilt to light. And for the judge there apprehended, the scene becomes the justice hall, and guilty have the victims pleaded. Struck by the vengeance beam, they fall. The truth behind this poem, along with Shakespeare's Hamlet, is that there is a higher power of natural law in the universe. It is why people who commit heinous crimes, though they may avoid persecution at first, ultimately they pay the consequences at the very end. And as Schiller said to his friend Goethe, it is not that the murderers are guilty about their crimes, but it's this principle of nemesis acting upon them, which compels them to throw off their facades. And as has been said, we face two paths today. We can establish a new security and development architecture based on the 10 fundamental principles Helga has outlined. We can bring in mankind into adulthood, crush oligarchism, and set economic policy in the direction of perfecting the capabilities of every human being, bringing about a new renaissance in science and culture in the process. Or we can bring about the end of humanity by refusing to make peace with Russia and China and provoking an all-out thermonuclear conflict. Either way, the so-called elites of the world, which people claim we can't overthrow, they'll be destroyed by their own rashness and hubris. So it's up to us, as Schiller might say, that we have to stop acting like little people, and we have to spark the better angels in our nature. So, thank you.
Thank you. I hope you will use that poem in the classes. I hope you'll consider that. Okay. And I was so engaged in your presentation that I forget what happened next. All right. Well, I will take a quick moment. We did have a comment come in from Moshe Rahman, who's our friend from from Bangladesh, from Bangladesh, who also wanted to contribute a comment on the 10 principles. And he focused in I have just a few sentences that he said. If we can bring the same technology from developed to developing countries, food security will be increased, poverty will be reduced. If we want to change the world, the people must be educated. Thank you for these 10 principles, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Okay, that's right. So upcoming, you'll have a wonderful presentation from our good friend, Frank Scher, and he is available live on Zoom momentarily, and he is communicating with us from Canada. And the subject of his discussion will be man's future in the solar system and beyond. And allow me to also give you wonderful news, which is that because we're running so late, you can expect to have a whole extra half hour, 45 minutes of wonderful presentations before the end of the day. So we won't get to our Q&A by 3, it'll be later. And thank you all for staying with us through this time and cooperating. Okay, so I'll wait for my thumbs up from Dave.
Hello, am I good to go?
Yes, you may. Thank you.
Okay. All right, perfect. Can you guys see my screen? All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frank. I am an aerospace engineering grad student and a member of the LaRouche Youth Movement now for over a year. And my presentation will be called Leaving the Cradle, Industrializing the Moon. I'd like to begin my presentation with a quote, and the quote is, "It suddenly struck me that that tiny pea, pretty and blue, was the Earth. I put up my thumb and shut one eye, and my thumb blotted out the planet Earth. I didn't feel like a giant. I felt very, very small." This quote, of course, was from the famous American astronaut and hero, Neil Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong was part of a series of missions that ended in 1972, which was the first and the last space program to land people on the moon. But before I get into that, I'd like to ask the question, why space? Why do we go to space at all? And to answer that, we have to come back to the Earth. So as of this year, 2023, at the beginning, we have just over 8 billion people in the world. And throughout history, we have discovered mathematics, music, and literature. And we've also invented the wonders of technology such as computers, satellites, and nuclear energy. And we've sent people such as Mr. Armstrong himself to the moon, and we've also sent probes to the most far reaches of the solar system. But of course, all is not perfect. These are some of the problems today. For example, 682 million people still live in extreme poverty, which is classified as under $2.15 per day. Yeah. There's about another billion people who live between $2 and $5 per day, which is hardly sufficient. There's a lack of access to reliable, cheap energy in almost every country around the world. And there's a lack of access to education, healthcare, and infrastructure for many segments of the population for all countries in the world. Particularly in the developed world, such as the United States, Canada, Europe, and their allies, there is a growing pessimism, especially among youth, and declining interest in engineering and real scientific progress. Now, I am quite confident that with the resources that we have today, we can solve most of these problems. We can solve all of these problems on the Earth. And the other speakers have shown you the path to how to do that. But we also must think long-term. Once we eradicate poverty, how do we make sure that it never comes back? How do we make sure that we can guarantee superabundance for every single person on the planet Earth? How do we make sure that every single person has the ability to fulfill their creative potential? How do we make sure that every generation can be inspired by the previous generation's achievements and surpass them with their own? How do we make sure that there is enough energy and power to power all the industry on the planet as it grows? And how do we make sure that there is a continuous supply of materials and new materials not found on Earth to power our technological advancements? Well, to answer these questions, we have to think big. How big? Well, let's look at it this way. Worldwide energy production in 2019 was about 617 exajoules. This is about 6 followed by 20 zeros, joules worth of energy. Now, the entire Earth receives about 3 million exajoules, which is about 3 followed by 24 zeros worth of energy in terms of sunlight per year. Now, it is quite inefficient to harvest this from the ground on Earth due to things such as the day-night cycle, the weather, and dust and other factors. But it is much more efficient to harvest this from space, for example, which doesn't have to worry about these factors. But even this pales in comparison to the total energy output of the sun, which is 1 followed by 35 zeros. And in relative terms, this is 1 followed by 15 zeros times greater than the worldwide energy production of the Earth. And even if we could just tap a tiny fraction of this, it would be enough to solve energy needs pretty much into perpetuity, as far as we know. Now, the second part of that, materials, I like to take the example of rare earth elements and precious metals. I take 3 examples here, which is the elements neodymium, gold, and platinum. Neodymium is a rare earth element, and it's very important for powerful magnets, which are used in electric motors, computers, and home electronics. Gold, aside from being useful in currency, is also a very great conductor, which makes it really important in transistors, circuits, anti-lock braking, and airbags. Platinum is a useful catalyst in industrial processes, which is used in detergents, fertilizers, and plastics. Now, on the subject of platinum, I'd like to take a case study which was done by Planetary Resources, which was actually a startup about 10 years ago, which estimated that a single platinum-rich asteroid may be worth more than $50 billion in today's mineral markets. And Caltech has estimated that it costs about $2.6 billion to capture a near-Earth asteroid around the orbit of the Earth. Now, this seems like a no-brainer in terms of investments and returns. And some might argue that $50 billion, that asteroid would not be worth $50 billion once you start mining it, because that amount of material would crash the market in terms of prices, that these metals would become very cheap. But we must also consider the knock-on effects in the economy. A huge supply of cheap metals, which are important in industry and in technology, could do wonders for these fields. Just imagine what cheap and reliable and sensors, computers, and chips could do, for example, for the development of automation and robotics. Now, unfortunately, Planetary Resources went under as a company. They did not succeed. Their goal was actually to mine asteroids, but there were several problems that they had to face. The main one can be, well, all of these can be summarized as a lack of infrastructure. For one, it is really difficult once you have that asteroid, even if you were to be able to mine it, to bring that raw ore back to the Earth for refining. There's also a lack of orbital infrastructure to facilitate mining. You would need facilities to house the mining vehicles, to fuel the mining vehicles, and you would also need all the personnel who maintain or crew those mining vehicles. And there's also a limited availability of launch vehicles and launch sites on the Earth. There's only so many rockets and rocket launching sites to send all of these vehicles into space and bring them back down. Now, there is a solution staring right at us for that, and that is the moon. The moon is actually a very convenient, is actually perfect for as a solution to these problems. For one, the moon is mostly oxygen by mass, which is in the compounds in the moon rocks and dust, and it contains lots of ice from comet impacts in the many craters that you see in this picture. This means that these elements can be extracted with various processes and to help sustain human life near, on, or around the Earth orbit. The moon itself is also rich in the very minerals and metals which I discussed earlier. And the moon has concentrations of uranium and thorium, which would be suitable for fission fuel as a source of energy. And finally, the moon is also a source of helium-3, a fuel that is very useful in fusion processes, which is difficult to find on Earth. Helium-3 is produced by the sun and comes out of the sun in the form of solar wind, but the Earth has a magnetic field which deflects a lot of these particles. The moon doesn't have a magnetic field, and thus these particles are embedded on the lunar surface and can be harvested. And good for us, there's actually is an existing plan to start the development of lunar infrastructure. That plan is a space project called Artemis, which was established in 2017 and is led by NASA with their partners in Europe, Japan, and Canada. Artemis plans to reestablish human presence on the moon. The components of Artemis are the Space Launch System, which will bring people from the ground into Earth orbit, the Orion spacecraft, which will go from Earth orbit to lunar orbit, the lunar gateway, which will be a permanent space station around the moon, which will have astronauts there full time, and the human landing system, which will land people from the lunar gateway onto the surface of the moon. And the human landing system is actually produced by SpaceX, and which is Elon Musk's company. And this will actually be the first lunar landing in over 50 years, and it's planned just 2 years from now. Now, this is the full timeline for Artemis. Artemis 1 has already launched and was quite successful just the end of last year. Artemis 1 was basically a test run of all the previous components I listed. Artemis 2 is going to be launched next year with astronauts aboard. This mission will simply circle the moon, not actually land on it, but the astronauts will be deploying and building the Lunar Gateway space station. Artemis 3 actually plans to land astronauts on the moon in 2025. Artemis 4 will be the second landing of astronauts, and they plan to complete or continue construction of the Lunar Gateway space station, which will happen in 2027. And Artemis 5 to 8 will land more astronauts and establish more infrastructure on the moon and build up a base of operations there. Now, don't get it wrong. The United States and Europe and Canada and Japan are not the only people in this game. For example, China has had a recent Chang'e 5 rover mission in 2020. They have another rover planned in 2025 and a manned mission planned in 2030. Now, this won't be a landing on the moon. It'll be simply circling the moon for now. Russia, always a space race contender, is continuing its Luna program from its Soviet Union days, with the Luna 25 moon rover set to launch this year in July. India has had successful landings on the moon, but unfortunately, the last rover crashed in 2019, and they're going to follow with another rover on 2023. There's also similar rover programs that has succeeded landing on the moon by South Korea, the United Arab Emirates, Italy, and other countries planned in the future. So once we establish the infrastructure on the moon, where do we go next? Well, the next goal for many is a human landing and settlement on Mars, which is the next closest and landable planet. We can also begin the construction of the orbital infrastructure, which will allow us to mine and process asteroid materials. And we can also begin the power generation from solar and nuclear sources from the moon and in orbit around Earth or orbit around the sun. And finally, we might even see the first self-sustaining human settlement on the moon in terms of permanent colonization of human settlements on the lunar surface. Now, for those of us who will be on the ground, what will be the benefits of this beyond just the materials? Well, for one, space is a science driver. The mission of space is a great proving grounds for all the scientists and engineers to push our technology and knowledge to its limits. The former head of NASA has given an estimate where about every dollar that was invested into the Apollo missions returned about $8 into the economy within the decade. This is because all of the technologies that they pioneer in pursuit of the moon landings at the time eventually made its way into civilian industries, things that we take for granted like computers and GPS and other technologies. Actually, a lot of it started with the Apollo missions. It also will inspire the next generation, a next generation of youth who will see the achievements of their parents' generation and be inspired to up those with their own. And finally, we can also allow for channels of international cooperation. Developing countries can work with developed countries to help them, because space is not a zero-sum game. With cooperations, countries can actually all of the countries involved can actually gain more from it, and developed countries can help developing countries in their technology, as we see with our friend in Uganda. Now, what can you do as a member of the audience sitting in your chair? Well, for one, you could become a scientist or engineer or an astronaut or technician and actually make these things possible. But you can also become activists and politicians who support space program, and this is absolutely crucial. For example, in the case of here, President John F. Kennedy, who started the Apollo programs. And these efforts are not only limited, of course, to the public sector. You can become entrepreneurs who start space industries, such as Elon Musk or the people who started Planetary Resources. Although that company went under, the next few companies might not. And finally, you can become informed world citizen who prioritize future generations and see the big picture of the advancement of humanity in general. Now, I'd like to end the presentation with this image from a Chinese artist named Fan Wennan. And he has a particularly bright vision for the future. Now, as you can see, there is a date set for that, which is 2074. Now, I am certain with our current progress, our current rate of progress, and with some luck, that we will see the first permanent human settlement on the moon in our lifetimes. And at least for the younger generation of people here. And perhaps even some of us ourselves will set foot on the moon. All right, thank you for listening to my presentation. I will be available for questions at the end of this section. Yeah.
I regret to inform you that we had some technical problems within the room, and so we missed a large portion of your presentation, but it was successfully streamed live to everyone watching. And so I encourage everyone who's watching to specifically come up with questions for Frank during the Q&A period. And all of us here will look forward to watching it on the archived stream. Thank you very much, Frank. Okay, so I'm very excited to introduce Anastasia Battle, who has recently made headlines as challenging both Barack Obama and Rashida Tlaib, the congresswoman in Michigan, who is part of the so-called squad. And I think that her actions give a great point towards what everyone can be doing to make a difference in the world right now. So please go ahead, Anastasia. Oh, I'm sorry.
No problem. How do I? Man, I got a 6'2" husband, so I get it. Hi, everybody. If I could have my PowerPoint up, please. Should I scoot over?
In a little bit more. There we go.
All right. Hi, thank you for joining us today. I want to focus on a very special project, which is not only the keystone connection for the World Land Bridge, but it represents the greatest act of principle that can end geopolitics as we know it. It's the Bering Strait Tunnel. And there's a very special person who was a long-term member of our organization that I want to introduce you to. Long-term collaborator of the LaRouche movement, very close friends with Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Zepp LaRouche. His name is Hal Cooper. You can get to the next slide, please. There's a picture of him at one of our conferences. it was a husband beating his wife. This poor woman was screaming in agony. So I grab a stick and we barge in the home, and the man very angrily starts to yell at me. So I start demanding him to let the woman go. And the man says, well, what right do you have to tell me how to treat my wife? And he says, well, I have the stick. To which you let the woman go. Go to the next slide, please. Hal used everything he had till the day he died, and probably even after that, to defend humanity. He would be so proud to have heard all of the presentations from all the youth in here. In fact, I was getting kind of welled up listening to a number of different presentations, but to know that his ideas and his work is passed on through you, and that you've taken on these concepts to then spread across the world and really take this on. And we have the opportunity now, especially right now, because the world is in a general spirit of inspiration, in a general spirit of determination to defeat empire because of all this work that we've done. And it's our responsibility to ensure that it happens. So I want to dive into this project here. The world looks quite a bit different when you see it from the Arctic, right? It's almost smaller, actually. You seem a bit closer to Russia. You seem a bit closer to Asia and other parts of the world. So can you hit the next slide, please? The Bering Strait is roughly 52 miles long, and there's 2 islands in between, Big Diomede and Little Diomede. You can see a close-up here. These islands between the strait form stepping stones, which actually make it fairly easy to build a bridge or a tunnel on there. It's almost like they were placed there. Who knows, but it makes it very easy for this. Can you go to the next slide, please? The original proposal was created in 1846 by the governor of Colorado, William Gilpin. And the idea that he had was to build a railroad up to the Bering Strait, then over a dam through to Russia, and then to connect with the Trans-Siberian Railway. This was a pretty bold idea in 1846. There was a huge opposition from the British financial interests. I'm sure people know that that part of Canada is called British Columbia for a reason. Because of all of this disruption, attacks on the rail lines by these British financial interests, they were saying, you know, this would disrupt our maritime interests. So they didn't want to let these rail lines actually get connected. The idea was left on the burner or pushed back. And unfortunately, it didn't happen, but the Russians were still very, very, very open to the idea. Can you go to the next slide, please? I don't think that's quite the right one. Go 2 more, maybe. No, it's bouncing around. It's the one of Tsar Alexander II.
You should have a clicker.
I don't have a clicker.
You had it up before. Down. There you go.
There we go. During the Civil War in 1862, Tsar Alexander II of Russia was approached by Britain and France to acknowledge the Confederate States of America. His response was documented in an interview as follows: "I will not cooperate in such action. I will not acquiesce. On the contrary, I shall accept the recognition of the independence of the Confederate States by France and Great Britain as a casus belli for Russia. And in order that the governments of France and Great Britain may understand that this is no idle threat, I will send a Pacific fleet to San Francisco and an Atlantic fleet to New York." Can you go to the next one? There's the fleet. Sealed orders to both admirals were given. My fleets arrived at the American ports. There was no recognition of the Confederate States by Great Britain and France. The American Rebellion was put down and the Great American Republic continues. After the end of the Civil War, Russia offered the Alaskan Territory repeatedly to the United States, with the eventual purchase in 1867. You can only imagine how furious the British financial at that point. Can you go to the next? In 1906, a company was incorporated in New Jersey, very close to here, which included Americans, Russians, and French, who pooled together $300,000. This is 1906 money, $300,000 for a detailed feasibility study, which once this was accomplished, the project was ready to go. They then organized another $3 million to make it built, to build it. And you know what happened? Anybody have a guess? This is 1906. What happened at this point?
They did it.
What's that?
They built it.
No. Another guess, quick.
Russia loses the war against Japan?
No, but you're
Close.
getting closer. World War One. World War One happens.
No, 1905?
1906, yeah, shortly after this.
1914 when the First World War.
1906. Yeah, I'm saying 1906, this project was going to be built, and then World War One happened, and this never happened. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, it takes a while to, yeah. So this was smothered again. So we used to know this history in the United States. We used to know about our relationship with nations like Russia. We used to know that they were a natural ally, that they defended us. We worked with them in the past. Now, I want to show you something which illustrates this, even up to a very recent time period. A short clip from a series called Why We Fight. Is anybody familiar with that? This is a Frank Capra, a series of documentaries that he made during World War II to show Americans why we're going into World War II to fight the Nazis. And one of them was titled The Fight for Russia. And could you play that little propagandists. This is how the United States used to feel about Russia. Ask yourself, how could the opinion of a nation we had worked so closely with for so long have changed in such a short period of time? What happened? What the hell happened? It's gotten to this point of insanity where we're now censoring, we're scrubbing off Russian names at the Metropolitan Museum. From Russian artists. Yeah, they're scrubbing their names off and changing their nationalities. It's absolutely disgusting. They're just wiping out history at this point. That's how crazy this is getting.
Vandalism.
No, it's actually the Met that's doing this.
Oh.
Yes. It's official vandalism. It is official vandalism. Yeah, here's the Bering Strait again. So I'm going to come back to this. In 2007, the Bering Strait proposal was officially picked up by the Russian railways as part of their 2030 railway plan. Fully electrified, double-tracked, high-speed rail main line stretching from Yakutsk to Fort Nelson. 3,700 miles of rail. At a presentation that was given, they go through, if you can go to the next slide, what this transportation corridor could do. This opens up massive development potential of raw materials in Russia, the United States, and the Canadian region, with the potential to carry 500 billion ton kilometers a year. That's roughly 3% of the world rail cargo flows. Hal Cooper put together just what this possibly could look like in terms of breakdown of raw materials, which I'm happy to provide these tables and things for people. Yeah, next, yeah, that one. In 2014, Chinese rail experts announced that the Chinese high-speed rail plan will encompass the Bering Strait Tunnel as well. They forecast that with the new technologies of high-speed rail, you could get from China to North America in 2 days, possibly less. Could you go to the next one? Now I want to add in just Hal Cooper's proposal, which we've talked about a little bit. But instead of this being high-speed rail, we could use magnetic levitation rail. Yeah. And at the Bering Strait, you could use a vacuum tube. And the concept of these ideas, of these technologies together, is that within a vacuum tube, because you have magnetic levitated rail, you can have constant acceleration without any impediment. So you can achieve super high speeds, like 1,000 miles an hour, possibly more. So I think that would probably shorten the time to get to Beijing, don't you think? I'm going to read you a quote here from a presentation that was given in 2007 by Dr. Viktor Rezbegin. He's the deputy head of Russia's Council for the Study of Productive Forces. He says, as a transnational project, the intercontinental link can improve international relations. It is a project that can change the world. It pulls together creative energies. Instead of putting up BMD systems, we can create a zone of international cooperation. Transnational infrastructure projects are the only real alternative to confrontation, including military confrontation between nation states and peoples. That's why these projects are still on the table. I mean, otherwise, why would Russia or China or any nation want to work with us right now, to be honest? I mean, you have to ask yourself, why are they still keeping an open hand. These other nations remember that we're natural allies with them. And the real question is, will the United States, will we remember that we're natural allies with other countries against imperialism for these ideas? The last thing I'd like to give you all a cultural offering, because I think it's important to keep your minds in this kind of space. Because people like Hal Cooper, people like Lyndon LaRouche, people who have come before us and have given us something to a mission to take on. So this is a poem called Friendship. When many veins and cracks have etched my memory and a soft alabaster glow washes over, I think on those that have chipped so carefully with measured pace and excited composure. Oh, what fine locks and gazes, graceful gestures and a dignified stance. Can we imagine all your phrases kept secret in every glance? What happy toil through every strike. Happier still, the rested dust. All minds of principle strive alike when one hand releases the careful brush. Therefore, this love is something rightfully inherited to those that are determinedly merited. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anastasia Battle. We're coming towards the end, last several presentations, and it continues on the theme of development and of inclusive of North America, to which Anastasia directed her attention. And so I would like to introduce my friend Cade Levinson, member of the LaRouche movement, to give his presentation, and he will be, he's actually provided a pre-recorded video, and then he will join us for the dialogue period. So here we go.
Hi, my name is Cade Levinson. I'm from Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I'm giving a presentation today on whether the decline of my city is due to historical overproduction or failed reconstruction. We're going to start here with just a short clip from a recent CNN video on a munitions factory in Scranton, Pennsylvania today.
In the steel furnaces of Scranton, Pennsylvania, the weapons of war are in high demand. 1-ton metal rods heated and forged into about 11,000 high explosive artillery shells a month. CNN got a rare look inside the Scranton Army ammunition plant, one of only a few in the country that make this crucial round. Here, specially made steel is heated 2,000 degrees, slowly shaped, step by scorching step, into its final product.
Nestled within a mineral-rich valley between the megalopolis hubs of Philadelphia and New York City, one can derive the totality of the characteristic of the great American experiment, its existing historical wanton impoverishment in the city of Scranton, Pennsylvania. Scranton epitomizes the tragic cascading arc of today's post-industrial cities. Its central role in literally tying the nation together with its production of T-rail during the American Industrial Revolution, and as the steel and energy powerhouse crucial to Union efforts during the American Civil War, were followed by increasingly precipitous decline, leading to its current state of industry described here in Chris Hedges' 2018 book, America, the Farewell Tour. We are government, education, and medicine, former Scranton Mayor Christopher Doherty said of the city's principal institutions. There is really no manufacturing anywhere. Hedges continues, this is not quite true. Scranton makes munitions. Weapons are one of the last products still produced in America. The Scranton Army Ammunition Plant, SCAP, makes a series of projectiles, including 105 millimeter and 155 millimeter shells. SCAP is part of a permanent war economy costing over $1 trillion a year. From another recent article on the Scranton armaments plant, it's not really possible to ramp up production of the 155 millimeter shell and then shut it down again if the war in Ukraine were to end in the next few months. It's also not economically feasible to keep paying for ammunition that no one is using just to keep factories open. Armaments production is a rare industry that, for national security reasons, has to remain, at least to a certain extent, in the United States. But the overall decline in the American industrial base still has an impact. There are fewer workers with the necessary manufacturing skills than there were when the Scranton plant began operating. Finding enough qualified workers hasn't been an issue in Scranton, where the armaments factory is a long-time presence, and many families have worked at the plant for generations. The United States Army plans on increasing the production of the type of munition produced at SCAP by 500%. Given these facts and Scranton's unique role of having both the fixed and variable capital, the plant, and the people required for such an increase in production, would not Scranton be best served economically by the indefinite continuation of the war in Ukraine? Regularly on the verge of municipal bankruptcy, what more could the city hope for than a permanent increase in demand for its last vestigial industry? Since 2012, Scranton has sold to private companies its sewer authority and parking authority in order to keep solvent. At least SCAP keeps the city afloat by putting its workforce into action instead of its essential holdings into fiscal prostitution. We can better understand Scranton's greatest benefit by understanding what led to its current state. Let's look at the history. What was the height of commerce in Scranton? A triangulation of energy production, materials manufacturing, and transportation made Scranton arguably the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. Its unparalleled reserves of anthracite coal fueled its iron furnaces, which in turn produced rail lines sent across the country. From Eileen Freeman's Anthracite Trust, the new economics of wealth and power, the Industrial Revolution, as viewed on the horizon of world economy, could only succeed with the help of the coal fields of northeastern Pennsylvania. Scranton produced the United States' first large-scale order of rail, which previously had to be imported from England. What was then called the Scranton Iron and Coal Company would eventually be producing 150,000 tons of iron and 500,000 tons of steel rail a year, accounting for 1/6 of the total national rail output. The city's growth rate for a good while was larger than that of New York City. The Civil War is often considered the apex of this period of production. To quote a local historian, the Civil War spurred rapid economic growth in Scranton. Economically, the Civil War was excellent for business in Scranton. The war effort increased the need for the anthracite, iron, and machinery, which the city specialized in producing, and both the coal mining of the valley and the work of the machine shops were doubled in a very short time. Local myth then indicts this as a fatal Icarus-like period of overproduction, and that the subsequent crash in demand sent the city on its prolonged plummet to its current deindustrialized state. As one founder of a borough of the city put in his memoir, A Half-Century of Scranton, both labor and capital began to develop the arrogance that insensibly grows from unbroken and unprecedented success. Perhaps Scranton would have most benefited then by never starting industries to begin with, or allowing Generals Jackson or Lee to make their way up through Gettysburg and take hold of the anthracite fields, as they wished to do. Folded into the Confederacy victory, Scranton could have become a sleepy, pastoral, purely agrarian economy, or just sold its coal on the global market and let the manufacturing and iron puddling to its betters. Or perhaps, if economic crash were inevitable post-war, Scranton should have fought for there to be a permanent war economy way back then, for the indefinite prolongation of the Civil War, and today it could be sending munitions to both Ukraine and Virginia. The faulty myth of overproduction produces both the extreme ends of this hypothetical hyperbola. The truth of the matter is that Scranton was at no point overproducing, but was from even before the Civil War, and especially subsequent to it, victim of the economic warfare of underdevelopment. As the leading economist of the American system, Henry Carey, put it, "The industrial history of the world may be searched in vain for any so wanton waste of wealth, happiness, and national power as has, by aid of the combined efforts of British and Eastern free trade believers in cheap raw materials and in the advantage of cheap labor, been perpetrated in the coal region of Pennsylvania." This is in large part due to the role water plays in mining. Most of the coal in the coal region of Pennsylvania is under the waterline. If you take the Lackawanna coal mine tour, you can hear the water around you as soon as you get below that waterline. For a mine to be viable, it needs to continually pump out this water, or the mine will flood and forced to be abandoned. Carey continues, mines must be kept free from water whether coal is shipped or not, and pumping is an expensive process. The difference to the operator from maintaining a mine in idleness on one hand or full work at the other is so small as scarcely to be imagined by those not familiar with mining operations. Stoppage to him, therefore, is almost utter ruin. When do stoppages occur? When demand is absent. A contraction in the currency makes money hard to get, lowering domestic commerce generally and the demand for coal subsequently. Or protections are lifted from the domestic coal industry and cheap imported coal floods the market. When these stoppages occur, Carey also puts out, the mine and the furnace, bases of the industrial pyramid, are always the first that are, by reason of absence of demand for their products, compelled to stop. They are too, always and necessarily, asked to resume operations. Carey estimated that previous to the Civil War, due to stoppages like these, the PA mining region made back not even 2/3 of the value that had been put in for the development of the region. Immediately following the Civil War, a gang of New England Tory manufacturers and the senators that represented them ensured both the contraction of the currency and the flood of cheap coal would occur. This and not overproduction primarily caused Scranton's decline. This Tory faction, through the procedural delay of a much-needed post-war tariff bill, aimed to continue importing cheap coal from Nova Scotia in particular, and to sabotage the industrial aspect of Reconstruction in general. That being the best way to retain their monopolies upon manufacturing and the increasingly contracted currency. Manufacturers in the South would have competed with New England in the development of textiles, and manufacturers in the West would have broken the dependency the West had on New England consumer goods, for which the West traded away most of the gold and precious metals they mined. This then continually solidified New England's monopoly upon the contracted currency. So New England wanted to make sure that there would be no reconstruction in the South or construction in the West, or the industrial aspect of it would be mitigated as much as possible. Carey often referred to this policy of prioritizing cheap raw materials and cheap labor over industrial development as the British system of political economy. The New England faction, perhaps tragically obsessed with making good on the name of their region, had taken advantage of Lincoln's assassination in order to enforce this British style of economy upon the recovering nation. The national instability and frequent stoppages of production therefrom led to the mining region of Pennsylvania, which had supplied the northern manufacturers and Union naval blockade with cheap fuel to win the war, to now be set as sacrifice after the war to the ideological relatives of the defeated British-backed Confederacy. Although the base of the nation's industry, producing its energy and basic materials, in the years following the Civil War, the coal regions of Pennsylvania were perhaps as much a candidate for economic reconstruction or just construction as the South and the West. This is what British policy does for its most productive colonies. On top of this, add the disaster of species resumption and the Morganization and monopolizations of the steel, rail, and energy industries, and you have the effective destruction of the American system of political economy. Track that to the present day, minus the two partial revivals of the American system under FDR and Kennedy, and you have the dream of global Britain, where the United States is but a dumb lummox enforcing British colonial policy by military might, and the only industry to be found is like that of Scap and Scranton. Instead of having increased its manufacturers and output in a win-win collaboration in the economic reconstruction of the South and the construction of the West, Scranton, now in its destitution, uses its last industrial capacities to load the gun aimed at itself and the rest of what's left of civilization, threatening nuclear suicide. What else could the nuclear holocaust? Not much. And it often expected to support much of, if any, of its previous organisms. Regardless of the extent of potential catastrophe to happen, we must recognize that certain irreversible problems at the stage of development we currently experience. In some perceptible and many currently imperceptible ways, the universe itself has been fundamentally altered by the irreversible process of reasoned development that no amount of megatonnage or radioactivity can ever fully erase. Let's lower the scale to the Now little is shared between these areas commercially or culturally. The transportation lines are either mostly historical relics or service some paltry amount of freight at low speeds and under negligent, decrepit conditions. But the characteristic of the development of those rails and canals and the commerce they supported is of an irreversible quality that persists even after a century and a half of economic warfare and can still be acted upon. Applying the right confluence of already emerging breakthroughs in energy, materials, and transportation, the revival of this region from the Hudson to the Lackawanna to Niagara into a highly productive economic corridor becomes a matter of natural order. Fusion research centers scatter this region, from those at Cornell and Lehigh University, as well as that of the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Former Governor Mario Cuomo commissioned a design for a high-speed rail system throughout much of what had been these canal and rail lines, that high-speed rail design having been patented and invented at the Brookhaven lab in New York. Most interestingly, recent efforts at a materials lab at MIT have shown the potential use of coal in both microelectronics, where it takes the place of silicon, and in a more cost-effective production of carbon fiber. Carbon fiber in general is 5 times as strong and 5 times as light as steel and doesn't corrode. How to activate these potentials? Lyndon LaRouche's 2006 Economic Recovery Act called for the formation of a federal corporation to manage the machine tools of the collapsing auto industry and repurpose them toward large-scale infrastructure projects. The same can be done today regarding the machine tools and potential productive output of the defense industries, like those of the plant in Scranton. As a preliminary step, local municipalities can be required to assess their store of machine tools and manufacturing potentials in even abandoned industrial centers. For example, the looms of the former Scranton Lace Company, currently gathering dirt and rust, can trade out their punch cards for modern computers and be formatted to weave the most complex pieces of carbon fiber. One section of the overall misguided 20 calls for the construct Carbon Materials Research Center in the major coal producing states. The one placed near to this northeastern Pennsylvania, upstate New York region should have a focus upon both the microelectronic and carbon fiber potentials of coal as a technology. As the Southwest Asia coordinator of the Schiller Institute, Hussein Haskari, has proposed for the petroleum producing nations of that region, Southwest Asia, that as we transition to a fusion economy, petroleum will be better used as industrial material. The same should be done for these coal-producing regions in the northeastern United States, especially for the production of carbon fiber, which has the best chance of supporting a full-scale mining industry. Finally, the last point of China's recently published position on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis concerns promoting post-conflict reconstruction. Anthracite coal is the rarest and highest grade of coal. Subsequently, it has unique potentials for industrial use. The anthracite region of northeastern Pennsylvania, where Scranton resides, has the largest reserve of anthracite coal in the world. The second largest reserve is in the Donbass, which stands for Donetsk Coal Basin. China is the largest producer of anthracite in the world. The CHIPS Act is not best suited by being an embarrassing effort at isolated zero-sum catch-up with China's microchip manufacturing, but by being the basis for a technology sharing program which brings the PA upstate New York corridor into the Belt and Road Initiative. Scranton is not best served by shipping munitions to Ukraine, but by sending and receiving scientists and technology between itself, China, and the Donbass in order to design the carbon materials on which the future of the world and beyond will be built. Scranton's most rewarding role is not that of cowboy-hatted Major Kong at the apocalyptic end of the film Dr. Strangelove, joyriding its missile production into the sunset of oblivion, but that of an economic fulcrum for the end of the conflict in Ukraine and playing the crucial role it should have played in the reconstruction of the American South and West, instead now in not just the Donbass in Ukraine, and not just the Scranton upstate region itself, but in the reconstruction globally of a new financial security and development architecture. Thank you.
What a fascinating presentation. Thank you very much, Kay. Okay, so I'm happy to introduce my friend, Dewey.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Can I get water? Yeah. Hello, everybody. Today, my presentation is going to be centered around the past, future, and present of fulfilling human activity here on my home turf, the North American continent. Thank you. These days, we're surrounded by a lot of pessimism surrounding the topic. Every headline all over social media and every conversation at work, everybody's small talk, we're very beaten down. There's a lot of fear, a lot of self-pity for the American today. Not for me. See, us Americans here in this room right now, we are all very sunny optimists, or we're going to be. By the end of my presentation, you guys are all going to be feeling butterflies. We get told a lot about what is wrong and what doesn't work in this country. And believe me, I've done some research and it's even worse than we're told. It's maybe because of this that an American is so easily pulled along by the large amount of solution mongers roaming today. A lot of them can be found around here. Right now, we're in the northern part of Brooklyn, and depending on if you Google your directions or ask around, it's either East Williamsburg or Bushwick. And got a little picture here. Next slide, a little solution concept from one of your pick of the Bushwick Williamsburg reading circles. Great utopian future.
Oh, it's utopia.
A lot of them. Yeah. So many powerful institutions as are represented here. We can see why maybe the ordinary American would be feeling a little bit antsy about his place in the world and his future. Yeah, here we have the presumptuous Howard Schultz right up there, tied to a rock, being absolutely ritualistically sacrificed by Jamie Dimon for the enjoyment of Charles and Camilla, their loyal son William, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett are sitting smugly in attendance. Oh, the guy, he's just there to deliver the Starbies. They are very happy. They're very happy to see our friend Howard Schultz. I'm sorry, he's not my friend. He's annoying too. But they're very happy to see him, almost as happy as the almighty GDP god that they're sacrificing him to, the great earth spirit of GDP and animals and nature and plants. Right. So I want to make sure I don't miss anything. Yeah.
It's slow.
Yeah, they're very happy to make this first of many sacrifices of the retail and service economy and the everything bubble to melt away as a very stable and steady green bubble can be constructed in its place. So let me see. I'm sorry. I'm terrible. I've got it right there. All right. Our hills, you can see in our future, our hills are dotted with taxpayer subsidized wind turbines. Our roads are bike-sized now, and we can imagine somewhere our policymakers smirking and shivering now that your home heating cost accounts for every future polar bear cub that it may harm. This might be a pretty hard sell for most of us Americans. But most people, when you get into the details, not going to like it. But the BBC and our K-12 educational system are told only to convey a general manic feeling of fear, and the solution usually winds up being just something, anything. That's why next slide, please. Because I'm wondering, why is the king of environmentalism anyway, coincidentally, the English monarch? And if he's so smart that our supposedly smartest billionaires and him are all in perfect agreement here and coming to sit at his ski party every year to talk about it, what happened to our American Revolutionary War of Independence? We don't really talk about it that much. There was battles and shooting. Next slide. And we're told maybe just enough about that aspect. Oftentimes, it gets attached to some sort of vague liberal feeling of self-expression, do as thou wilt, lower taxes, legalize it, etc. It's not a strong promise for a great future, and I wouldn't give up a Christmas for it, like Washington did. What was he thinking about here that made it worth it? What was keeping him warm during the crossing? Next slide. Erie Canal. Here we go. Next slide. Yeah, this is what it's all about here. This is what we had to fight for. This is a picture of the Erie Canal. Next slide. It didn't exist back then. So Washington, we all know, was a surveyor in his home state of Virginia before the Civil War. We all know this. But while he was there surveying, or his time as a general, he was he was trying to find a way for the colonists at that point to, even though it was illegal to do so, make their way west of the Appalachian Mountains and find ways to establish enterprise out there. Back then, it was illegal to do this, and at the same time, other founding fathers were in the processes of setting up illegal mills in other parts of the country. It was illegal back then to construct a mill in the United States. It was as illegal as it was to cross the Appalachian Mountains, and from the British perspective, it's one issue. Should the colonial subjects produce from their own mills, or they would from the west of their border, England would have no say or share in it. And the more land they had access to, obviously, past the Appalachian Mountains, the more places you have to go look. Here we go. I have the next slide, please. Yeah. After the most of the hard fighting of the war was over, but before peace was reached, General George Washington writes in his letters, yeah, this is him fighting through the, as in the statue of George Washington. Is there the one with the quote? Here we go. He writes in his letters, he is, oh, yeah, yeah, the printer, yeah, this is much better. See, up the Mohawk, the Fort Schuyler, crossed over the Wood Creek. This is him going through the Hudson River, which, you know, is not so far away from where we are today in New York City. And all the way to, he proceeded up to the Mohawk River, which connects to the Hudson River, to Fort Schuyler, formerly Fort Schuyler, crossed over to the Wood Creek, which empties into the Onondaga Lake and affords a water communication with Ontario. Then I traversed the country to the east of the branch of the Saskatchewan and viewed the Lake of Tesco and the portage between that lake and the Mohawk River. By these observations, I could not help taking a more contemplative and extensive view of the vast inland navigation of these United States from the maps and information of others, and could not but be struck with the immense diffusion and importance of it, with the goodness of that providence which has dealt her favors to us with so profuse a hand. Would to God we may have wisdom enough to improve them. I shall not rest contented till I have explored the Western country and traversed those lines, or a great part of them, which have given bounds to a new empire. And I think it's on the next slide. So what he's taught is here, the Hudson River, going all the way up until it connects with the Mohawk River. And over here, these are the huge mountains, which are such a problem. But over here where the Mohawk River goes, and it winds up right over here, and it almost connects to Lake Ontario and the Great Lakes, and that opens up a whole lot of easy access to the Midwest. It's almost as if whatever great necessary being was creating the geography of the United States put a little test for us right here. It's just a little tease. You almost, if you're just a massive, huge canal right over here, you'd have it all set up. It's all lined out for you, like the way you'd give a puzzle to like a little kid, you know? and you do it almost all the way. He's so great. And Washington understands this. He sees it and he's very excited about it. Yeah, so while he was out there in the war business, he sees the great miracle of the Mohawk River and how it almost connects to Ontario. All right, so then after the war is over, Washington takes control of the company to build the Potomac Canal, which is down near in Virginia area. But he's still very, very excited about the possibility of a canal connecting Mohawk River to Lake Ontario. But while he's down there trying to build the slide here, they're trying to gather enough capital in order to construct the Erie Canal because of how obviously necessary it is. And here we have Thomas Jefferson, the negative Nancy of his day. They had them at all days, all eras. It's a constant. Why, sir? Here is a canal of a few miles projected by General Washington. He's talking about the Potomac Canal, which wasn't completed then, which if completed would render this a fine commercial city, blah, 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 because a small sum of $200,000, which was more back then, necessary to complete it cannot be obtained from the general government. And he says, well, how are you going to build a 350-mile canal if we're trying to build this Potomac Canal and it takes a long time? Well, you just got to put the money down. Oh, how are you going to pay for it, warns Jefferson? We have a response. Next slide. So this is something that was written about conversations with Gouverneur Morris, who was a big money man and finance guy in New York City and author of the preamble of the Constitution. How are you going to pay for it all? And then he replies, when confronted with this at his office, labor improbus omnia vincit, which translates to labor conquers all, which is true. Next slide, please. So yes, they did dig the Erie Canal, spoilers. We've got it now, and it's such a great, I mean, there's a picture of it at first. It's such a great opportunity for us. And afterwards, there was a big renaissance of canals in America. Wound up, these were the height of development corridors in their day. And still now, there's canals that we could have that we don't build. It's absolutely just an inspiring amount of work that went into all of these. After the course paid for itself magnificently and continues to do so. Here we go. Next slide. So after Lincoln's reorganization of the US economy comes a great boom of rail lines in the United States, much of which is still in use, but the trains have to go much slower now because of stock price minded owners like Warren Buffett trying to cut costs rather than produce outcomes. In some other countries where maglev is in use, they follow the opposite trends, where as the years go on, the trains go faster instead of slower. Japan and China are good examples of this, but I bet you did not realize that the inventors of this technology, next slide, were Americans in the Brookhaven National Laboratory. That's right. Maglev was invented in Long Island. And Mario Cuomo, next slide, tossed some ideas about implementing it, connecting to cities like Buffalo, Boston, Montreal, but none of it ever got anywhere besides the commission for it, and none of it really took off. It's sad. We don't really build so much rail in this country anymore. We're still using the ones from Lincoln, and then if we ever send a construction worker out to a rail line, maybe it's to break it down. Next slide. Yeah, so this is the, oh, geez. This is the, well, Anastasia's picture was better. This is a World Land Bridge. Something you might have seen before. We've got right there the Bering Strait connection, the famous Bering Strait tunnel. Next slide. Oh, man. Well,
would you like to borrow this?
Sure. So the Bering Strait tunnel, this is in Alaska, right? But people say, well, what's in Alaska anyway? that you're going to have a, let's go all through all this trouble to build a rail through it just so we can eventually come to Russia. We got to spend all of our time in Alaska first. And what's over there? Well, of course, there was nothing at the Erie Canal before they dug it. It was just a meadow back then. And Alaska, I'm telling you, has a lot of potential. Next slide, please. Alaska is it New York of the future? Some say yes. Some say yes. Next slide. Some say yes. See, this is called the A2A rail. So it's something that's currently in study right now, but it's definitely going to be built, I guarantee, because of the fact. Next, can we go next slide? Yeah, this is something. Unfortunately, it's been made illegal for you to have any oil tankers over at any of this part of British Columbia at all, which makes it very hard for Canada to sell oil through the Pacific. And already Canada sells 97% of all of their oil to the United States through pipelines. But okay, prior slide, the slide before this one. The A2A rail, because of this, it's going to be a rail that takes the oil from British Columbia and moves it all the way over to Alaska so that the soonest possible opportunity, they can start selling it at the port right there into the Pacific, which maybe you think is, I mean, they could have just let them sell it in Canada's British Columbia, but I think it's still a great opportunity to build new rail on this continent and into Alaska. It's very important what we got to do, because listen, it might not mean so much now, but there's all these minerals up there, and you've got what could be a development corridor starting out. Next slide. Next slide. This is the Yukon River, which is a massive river in Alaska. And this is the other resource that they have, which I think is very important and very untapped. Because just like how Washington went up the Mohawk River and saw the great test God, the necessary being had given us, and the great opportunity for mankind to turn it into its purposes and use it. This is the Yukon River, has that times many more. The Yukon River outflows massively just straight into the ocean. And if we were to tap this huge potential, we would be able to irrigate all of the deserts in the United States and a lot in Mexico. Yeah, so next slide. So yeah, this is Alaska. You see massive amount of wilderness, all of these rivers flowing through and dropping off into the ocean. See, just like navigation, I mean, how hard was it to map all this? And then next slide. This is my friend Robert Kennedy. Yes, John Kennedy. My friend John Kennedy. And over here is a printout of the Nawapa project. So I'm going to have a much clearer image of it on the next slide. Yeah, here we go. This is the Nawapa project, where we have a reservoir where we dam off parts of the Yukon River, and where we take maybe only 20-something% of it, we're able to achieve so much. So first, what we've got to do is we got to create a reservoir up there in Canada to trap this water, and then through the power of hydroelectricity or maybe nuclear power, we're going to pump it up through tunnels into the mountains up here. And then next slide. Yeah, this is by the way, currently Lake Mead is the largest reservoir in the United States. So just for these are the reservoirs, some of the reservoirs we're going to be making in Alaska with this Yukon River water. It is many times larger, you can see, and this is only a little fraction of the amount of water that the Yukon is going to still be putting out into the ocean. This is how much we're going to trap, and then what are we going to use it for? Next slide. So once we've got it through the mountains and through different tunnels and canals and other reservoirs, we're going to pump it up through huge amounts of water pumps, which will be powered by the hydroelectricity or nuclear power we're using the water for, just by the motion of it. And then we're able to move it throughout the country into first we have here Utah, Colorado, all these desert areas where they don't have enough water for the agriculture they need to do or the industry that they need to build there. We're going to help them out with that. And then still we've got more to spare going into Mexico, Texas, and different parts of the country. Then next slide. Yeah. So this is how much of the land we're going to get here. We take it all the way up, we pump it up through great technology, which is actually very old at this point, and we move it through here. The only reason we never built this is because supposedly, oh, how are you going to pay for it? Next slide. So my friend, yeah, my friend Franklin Roosevelt had constructed a, for his time, very large, and for today, even more so, very large federal project of government taking this dam, building it, putting it there in California and turning the deserts into very, very beautiful, luscious green land, which can be farmed. And he was able to do this as part of his Great Works project. So we know it's possible. And, I don't know anyone besides a couple of crazies would say that this was a bad decision. It works out for us. God wants us to do it. Next slide. Oh, wait. Okay, so slide before. I didn't give you the updated slide. I'm sorry, but my others, there's no reason for me to get worried about it. My other slides, we're just going to be talking about the fact that we have not only all of this water moving everywhere, but we also have all of these new canals and waterways across Canada and the United States, some of which can be used for barges, especially the ones in Canada will have even more ways to trade through water transportation. And then you think about this, it's hard to visualize it in black and white, but we're turning every gray and tan part of this country almost into a great green and happy field. I had another picture of happy wolves frolicking, but throughout this, but you can imagine that this is the power of humanity to overcome all of these, quote unquote obstacles put in front of us through the power of our dialogue with the natural world and the natural principles that we take advantage of in order to transform it into a better and more beautiful place. So then, okay, next slide. So then this is the future of it. Eventually, we're going to be doing this all to space, which I haven't seen Frank's presentation yet, unfortunately, because of the technical difficulties, but I'm sure he explained it all really well. And this is our astronaut waving goodbye to us in the past. He's in the future, waving goodbye to all of us and saying, great job bringing us to this point. Great job bringing us here. Thank you very much. Next slide, Finn. All right.
Thank you, the inimitable Dewey. So we will conclude. We're not going to conclude because there's still going to be time to talk, but we got to be out of this room at 5, and it is now 4. And the next presentation is going to be a fantastic overview of a fusion economy. It's not a brief presentation. It's a substantial one in a very good sense. So I'm just alerting people who are in the room and who are watching live that we'll have a little bit of time for some discussion. The rest of us who are here in person will gather afterwards and have plenty of opportunities to talk. We've identified a restaurant that we might be able to go to, those who would like to join. And those who are watching online and who watch the video after the fact, I hope that you sent in some good questions and so forth and follow up. Good. We'll get to that as soon as we hear from Stuart. And if there's anything else people really want to bring up, then make sure that you're ready to do that so that we can have a fruitful concluding discussion period after Stuart's presentation. So therefore, let me introduce my friend Stuart Battle, and his presentation you'll see is a pre-recorded video. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, thank you. So, 10,000 years ago, human civilization consisted only of a smattering of local coastal villages living off their immediate surroundings. Then, gradually, you had mariners who began to emerge, displacing these small coastal civilizations because the ocean-traveling peoples were able to travel more widely, generating more goods with trade and amassing more wealth than their land-loving companions. These maritime people had a new power that the others didn't. This was the knowledge of the stars, not simply as beautiful lights to look at, but as patterns of motion that could be used as a means of navigation. This scientific advancement of the ocean navigators gave them a leg up against anyone else who didn't have the same power. These maritime civilizations began to conquer and replace landlocked peoples, paving the way for the first empires in the world. As is known, this went on for millennia. Then, around the dawn of the modern age, a new change began to be introduced. Internal improvement systems emerged, such as canals and aquifers. Areas that had previously been inaccessible to civilizations were now opened up. Population centers grew. A canal meant that new areas were open to large-scale trading and transport, which previously were only open to individual merchants by foot. Connecting new areas, new inland areas. So this step took an even further step forward with Charlemagne in the 8th century, who actually attempted to connect all European watersheds together through a short canal, which would connect the Rhine and Main river basins in what is today Germany with the Danube River. It's unclear whether this project ever successfully was completed at the time. It was many hundreds of years later, and of course is today. But nonetheless, it set in motion an entirely new way of conceptualizing economies. Now, this process further advanced with the dawn of the industrial era and the railroad, again, displacing the previously maritime-based civilizations. And you can see here a map in the late 1880s of what had sparked merely 20 years previously, the transcontinental railroad in the United States, transforming the whole continent. Lyndon LaRouche called this process real physical economics, where the introduction of new powers such as these put mankind on a higher platform than had previously existed. This is how to think of what the fusion economy means. Now, to give a sense of fusion power, look at this image. As you can see, comparison between wood, coal, oil, and then uranium. The difference is substantial in terms of how much weight, how much mass of a given amount of fuel corresponds to the same amount of power created through that fuel. So with fusion, just to take the next step, rather than bursting apart atoms in the case of uranium, fusion is a different process, forming new atoms, fusing atoms together, which releases tremendous energy. And it is estimated that anywhere from 10 to 100 times more energy is released in the case of fusion. So think about this in relation to this graphic with wood and coal. Now, following the discovery of atomic power in World War II, we were on the track of harnessing fusion as a commercially viable source of energy not too long afterwards. There was a number of programs that began in the US. Was increased. We were rapidly advancing our mastery of the atom. In 1980, a bill for full fusion funding was passed through both houses of Congress, although unfortunately it was never actually followed through on. I don't have the time to go through much of the history today, but I will just say that in the 1980s, fusion was essentially sabotaged almost entirely. Funding was cut. any mission-oriented program was shuttered. You can see in this picture, this is an image of what's called the Mirror Fusion Test Facility, which was a new type of reactor, a new test reactor, completed in 1986. Unfortunately, the same day, literally, it was completed, the funding was cut and the program was mothballed. So just to give you an example of what happened to the fusion program. So now, why is fusion significant? You might be asking, what are we talking about? What will it do? So first, you have the quantitative changes, which is essentially massive energy access and the ending of energy poverty worldwide. If you look at this chart, you get an idea of what we're dealing with in terms of energy poverty. From the case of some of the poorest parts of Africa and Southwest Asia, Central African Republic has merely 300 kilowatt hours per capita per year of energy consumption. And you can see that much of the world is in very, very minimal energy access if you compare it to Europe and the United States. And again, this is itself inadequate because we all know the standard of life in the United States is far below what it should be, including the energy consumption rate. And I would just say, it is well known that energy consumption is in direct correlation to life expectancy every time. There is no such thing as a nation with a high life expectancy and low energy consumption. And just another way of looking at this, consider the image here and imagine the work yet to be done across the world. So the emergency of energy poverty must be solved and rapidly. International collaboration must be marshaled to accomplish this with plentiful amounts of fossil fuels and the latest generation of nuclear power plants in every country. However, with a proper international crash program for fusion, which we should do, then hopefully we could have the first reactor within 10 years or so. This will forever eliminate energy scarcity to banish it only to history books, which I think is an important image to keep in mind. Now, again, what are we talking about here? Because rapidly reducing the costs of energy does improve people's lives. However, it does much more than that. Think about droughts currently hitting the Western states, Mexico, all across Southwest Asia, Africa. With abundant, cheap energy, ocean water desalination, new modes of irrigation become more than possible. They become something where you're able to transform whole regions of deserts into new land. And I just want you to look at this image of the Nile Delta in Egypt, where you can see the surrounding of the Nile River, very narrow stretch of water, when utilized by mankind in the case of Cairo, Egypt, and mankind's infrastructure. And this is a very limited example. Not only can you transform areas that were previously deserts, but with some forethought, we can create new water cycles that go into plant life and therefore create new patterns of evaporation and precipitation. New climate patterns could also be created, essentially giving man the ability to terraform parts of the planet, which is very exciting. I also want to mention that one of the fuel sources for fusion is deuterium, which is abundantly found in seawater. So what you're looking at is essentially infinite fuel possibility in the case of fusion. To give it a sense of this, think of what former Atomic Energy Commission Chairman Lewis Strauss said in 1954, who was, by the way, a very large proponent of fusion power. He said, "Our children will enjoy in their homes electrical energy too cheap to meter." Similarly, a few years later, Congressman Mike McCormick, who was the guy who introduced the 1980 fusion bill in Congress, he said that fusion could be the most important deterrent to war in all of history. So I hope you're getting the idea of this quantitative change and what we're looking at. But there's another element of the fusion economy, which is the qualitative change, which is the development of capabilities that were never possible, not even with increased quantitative energy, that were not physically possible with lower densities of energy. One particularly exciting example of this is what's called the fusion torch. Basically, when you fuse an atom, temperatures required are in the tens or hundreds of millions of degrees, which is hotter or as hot as or hotter than the sun. When you heat matter up to this state, to a plasma state, its molecular structures break down, leaving only the elements themselves, which is the concept behind the fusion torch, turning any matter back into its constituent elements. If you look at this next image, you can see just a brief concept of what the fusion torch is. You can see plasma coming in from the reactor. You can see solids, any sort, being introduced, and then that being separated using different magnetic fields and other means to separate out the constituent elements from whatever you want. So you could do this with waste fuel. You could do it with landfills. You could even do it with the so-called Great Garbage Patch in the Pacific Ocean. These have become resource-rich gold mines. So it's phenomenal. You could even do this. It's been supposed you could do it with raw dirt. If you took 1 cubic mile of raw dirt from the Earth's crust, there's enough trace elements that are dispersed throughout that far exceed the average annual production in the United States with things like aluminum, iron, tin. Far more is in 1 cubic mile of dirt than the United States consumes in a whole year. So talk about recycling, right? This really does put an end to the false belief in limited resources, which is a plague that people still live with. So now another exciting thing that comes with the fusion economy, cheap, abundant energy, and further mastery of atomic processes is new isotopes. An isotope being something that is the same element, but has a different atomic mass. You can see here the case of the 3 hydrogen isotopes with adding a neutron to the nucleus. In the case of deuterium, it is this is the case I was mentioning earlier about a fusion fuel. Now, there are over 3,000 known isotopes, 250 of which are stable and usable, and all of which have different properties, whether it's thermal, magnetic, electrical, or mechanical, which means many different potential uses. Without going into too much detail, the naturally occurring elements and their isotopes have only given us so much in existence. However, as mankind enters the atomic age, we're increasingly discovering how to utilize and synthesize new isotopes that are not naturally occurring, but which are unique and powerful in their properties, which were not previously available. For example, there's millions of medical procedures every year which use synthetic isotopes, including the latest effective cancer treatments. Food is irradiated and made safe. Advanced industrial processes are completed. Many of the cutting edge processes in the economy are using man-made isotopes, which never would have existed if it weren't for this new power that mankind has developed. We are essentially custom making matter. So that's an exciting prospect. And I just want to, from there, move on, because you don't want to forget the effect fusion power will have on the coming space age. Chemical rockets, as far as our advancement into space, have succeeded only so far. They've, of course, done what neither wood nor coal could accomplish, which is to get us out of Earth's atmosphere. But when over 90% of the weight of your rocket goes towards simply the fuel to get to low Earth orbit. You have to consider, what if we want to travel to further parts of the solar system? What if we want to explore entirely different star systems? How about other galaxies? It has been estimated that there's as many as potentially 2 trillion galaxies in the universe. If mankind wants to have a future in the universe, fusion energy, the density that it represents, the density of its fuel, will be the similar transformative effect as the steam engine had over travel by foot, if not more. And this really will be the final entry of mankind into the space age. So just to come back to it, the advent of fusion power really is a new platform for the human species, which will only continue to grow. Contrary to the Malthusians and the zero growthers, who argue against mankind's use of science and in favor of reducing his footprint on the world, fusion power's mere existence will demand that mankind live up to his true potential, that of being in the image of the Creator. Possibilities are limitless as we will come to harness this power that literally is what runs the stars. Now, lastly, I just want to say that there have been a number of very exciting breakthroughs recently in fusion research, which indicate just how close we are if the political support and funding were provided. Last December, the first ever break-even in a fusion reaction was achieved at Lawrence Livermore National Labs in California. This is a picture here of the Lawrence Livermore, which is a series of 192 lasers which compress a fusion fuel. 50% more energy was produced than was put into the reaction, which is the first ever. Then following, shortly thereafter, just in January, China's experimental advanced superconducting tokamak, which you can see here, announced that it had achieved a new plasma mode, which allowed the plasma to remain in a stable state for 20 minutes, which is unheard of. Now, these were both isolated experiments, but points to the potential that exists. Plus, it's important to remember that the US and China are, or at least in the case of China from our United States, is considered an adversary. Imagine what we could do if the US was collaborating with China on a fusion program and sharing their discoveries together. Even imagine what we could do if the money that's been spent preparing for war, particularly with Russia and China, instead was spent on making this history-changing breakthrough. Just imagine what kind of different world we would be in. So I think that this paints a clear picture of where the world could go, and I think we should work together to make it a reality. Thank you.
Okay, give another round of applause for all of the presenters over the course of the day. Thank you to absolutely everyone. We've made it. We've made it all the way. And so we have until about 4:40-ish, because then we're going to have to pack up and we have to be out of this room at 5. So I want to invite anyone who has a question, throw it in. And I'm going to start with one that was communicated to me. And this is directed towards Frank, Jason. I think Stuart can be included among those. With specifically to Frank. Thank you for your presentation. The capture of asteroids just outside of and sometimes in near-Earth orbit as the creation of an extraterrestrial mining industry might be treated as dual aspects of what has sometimes been described as a strategic defense of Earth, or SDE. That proposal, first discussed in the early 1990s, is sometimes thought of as a successor to Lyndon LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative of 10 years earlier. Have you studied the various iterations of the Russian SDE proposal, or is there any proposal by China for joint work with Russia on these matters, including extraterrestrial mining? Are there studies that exist or institutes or individuals that are engaged in this work? While the present political climate may appear to be deeply inconducive to this work, it does not mean that it should or has necessarily been abandoned. Okay, very interesting question. So Frank, we'll go to you to see if you have a response to this. Were you able to hear it?
Yes, I was able to hear it. I have to admit,
However, you might like to.
Yeah, I'm not super knowledgeable on the strategic SDE. I know about the SDI, which Lyndon LaRouche proposed with about the defense of Earth against asteroids. What I can say is that in terms of recent developments, there was the Near-Earth Rendezvous satellite mission where NASA crashed a probe intentionally into an asteroid as a test. One, for potential mining in the future, and two, if you can actually move asteroids, you can definitely move them away from a collision course with the Earth. So I'll pass on that question to Stuart or Jason to specifically address the SDE.
Thank you, Frank. Jason, would you like to? Good.
Just to say a little bit more about the SDI, the threat of thermonuclear warfare is supposedly prevented by the fact that if anyone uses a nuke, everyone will use nukes and everyone will die, therefore don't use it in the first place. Lyndon LaRouche didn't think that was the safest way to arrange things because, I don't know if you're aware of this, but sometimes accidents happen. Accidents happen all the time. Think about all the accidents you've been involved in or witnessed or or caused. And now imagine that your job is to launch nuclear missiles. There were many close calls where radar systems said, oh, the Americans launched their nukes. It's time for Russia to fire back. And thankfully, the guy on duty said, I am not pushing that button. I'm not passing on this order. We're not going to do this. Same thing happened with the submarine, where the people on the sub said, you know what, we're not doing this. We're just not going to do this. And thankfully, they obviously were false alarms and we're still alive. But we could have all been dead. So LaRouche said, instead of doing things this way, let's work with the Soviet Union to make a new defense against nuclear weapons overall. Let's use lasers and particle beams from space to be able to zap down these missiles as they come around. We can work together on it. It'll be good for both of our economies. We're going to improve science and technology, and we're not going to run the risk of destroying the entire human race. So it was a very good idea. Ronald Reagan went with it in '83. And Reagan called it the Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, the Strategic Defense of Earth is a proposal from Russia that's along a similar direction, saying let's cooperate on defending the entire Earth, not in this case from nuclear weapons, but from asteroids. So what's involved in defending the Earth from asteroids? One, knowing that they're coming. So we need more telescopes and satellites and things to actually identify all the asteroids that might strike us. We think we're pretty sure that if it was big enough to kill everyone on Earth, we would have found it by now. But there's a lot of smaller ones that might just, destroy New York City, and I don't think we'd like that. So we need to do that, and then we need to be able to do something about it. Let's say NASA says an asteroid is coming. It's going to hit New York City in 2 weeks. How do we respond? Yes, right. We leave New York City, and it's having some warning would be good. At least we could save ourselves and things we could, but the whole city would be ruined. The houses, right? People are gonna be homeless. Terrible. Wouldn't it be great if we could do something about it? So what if we could go out there and move an asteroid off course? If we know farther in advance, even a little push can be enough to make an asteroid miss the Earth. What this means is to be able to get out to an asteroid quickly. You just can't do it with the kind of rockets we've got right now. Stuart was talking about the vast, vast majority of the weight of a rocket on the ground is fuel. What do you need the fuel for? To lift the rest of the fuel. And what do you need that for? To lift the rest of the fuel, plus the rocket, to lift the rest of the fuel, plus the payload. So chemical rockets are inherently extremely limited. With a nuclear-powered rocket, you wouldn't have to have this enormous amount of fuel. You could shoot a rocket that instead of just firing for a few minutes and then coasting towards an asteroid, it could keep its engine on. It could go faster and faster and faster and go to Mars in a week instead of 9 months like it takes us right now. So those are some of the, just like the Strategic Defense Initiative of Reagan, of LaRouche, would have made specific new scientific and technological advances that would be useful in many ways and kept us safe from something that could kill us all. The strategic defense of Earth will keep us safe from something that'll kill us all, asteroids, and at the same time would be a great driver for making breakthroughs in fusion, in space, and things like. So there we go. So we should do that. And then on the asteroid side of that thing, just a couple resources people could look at. The China Lunar Exploration Program, in situ resource utilization is part of what they're looking at. And there are conferences and books and things on this topic of doing things on asteroids or industrializing the moon, a phrase you might want to look up if you're searching for that, in situ resource utilization, which means just using things off the Earth, using things out there. Okay.
Thank you. Anyone here who would like to raise a comment or a question? Okay, I have, are you coming up? Okay, by all means. And please introduce yourself.
I'm Benjamin Scalera. I have a few comments about we need to give people a mission. And sometimes I think people, since there's so many different kinds of people living together, there's different people that have different ideas of what their mission should be. And sometimes if there's a whole lot of the same kind of people in the same place, like when the Amish people are living together, they all know the way they live and what their mission is in their life. So for a long time in America, our mission was kind of like to go against some kind of evil, and we were united against something, to go against the Nazis or something for the Revolutionary War. We were brought together by wars, but we need to bring each other together by something else too. A very important point about the trains. I've been learning a lot about trains with my brother. We definitely need to have more trains in America. America has been way too obsessed with cars, and trains are a much more efficient way of traveling. And there's a lot less friction with the train wheels on the rails. So America has been subsidizing the roads so much, and we should be subsidizing the trains more. We should be encouraging more people to travel by train and not just using the trains for freight. For most of the people in this country, we don't even know that the trains are a great way to travel. At least around this area, this is maybe one of the few exceptions where we actually have a good train travel for New Jersey Transit, and around the New York City area, we have good trains that I was able to get here today from my house all the way here by using the trains. I took the New Jersey Transit and then the PATH train and then the L train, and it worked very well. We need to get more people around America to recognize that there is an alternative to have more people living closer together, and then use trains for transport and just cars.
Can you make this your last comment?
Yeah, and one more thing, how sometimes the producers are not producing the same way they used to. I've seen some people commenting online how there's just not as much of a reason to produce these days with inflation and some kinds of shifts in our society, how it's harder to date. So women are expecting people to earn even more than they used to years ago. So it almost seems like it's not worth it to get a high-paying job if it's hard to get married to someone. You have to have a reason for the producers to produce.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to have Diane come up. If you would please respond, and then give us your remarks here at the end of our session.
Well, those are good questions. I think the question is, we have to consider what is the mission of mankind as a whole. And then to get there, there's very interesting things about mission, like Alexander Hamilton on the subject of manufacturers described what happens when you advance your economy, that you end up with a much greater diversity of types of skills and labor. For example, if we were going to actually build a high-speed rail network in the United States, what would be involved in that? We now, I think every last steel company in this country went bankrupt. So we would need steel. And this gets to Liam's point about we're not going to be able to do it unless we work with China or work with other places, right? And then while you're building the thing, where are people going to live? What are they going to eat? What are the other materials involved? And suddenly what you discover is, because you're embarked on a mission to create this national rail grid, that you need millions of people feeding into that process, doing all different things that you hadn't considered, right? And so but to what end?
Right.
That's the interesting.
My main point is
Yeah.
that most people think that trains are not worth it.
Well, it would help if they didn't derail all the time. I mean, it's people have had such horrible experiences on them. So we have to improve it. And part of, when FDR built the Tennessee Valley Authority, people didn't know why they should have electricity. They actually had to send people down there, demonstration agents, with electric washing machines and dryers and say, here, just think how much time you could save if you didn't have to roll all your clothing through this, right? So we should probably have samples. Maybe we should have a program to send thousands of Americans over to China to ride on their maglev trains and get a sense. Or, because people have, one thing we've really lost, I have to say, is our educational system. People remember here in New York, we defeated I keep forgetting which one, Common Core, I think that's what it was called. Yeah. What was the idea? No more fiction. Don't allow children to read fiction, only informational texts. The goal for a 5-year-old is to be able to order something online, have it delivered, and read the instruction manual. Mm-hmm. Now, if that's all you know, how can you even consider the future? Or we don't know the things we're going to be inventing in the future now. But if you have an imagination, you might be able to have a hypothesis about it, or you might be able to give yourself a whole range of potential options. But if that area has been stopped, what a horrible world. And now we have drugs for that. So we're working on producing psychedelics, and then you don't have to worry about producing anything because you can visit there in your mind, as Zelensky says. We can retake Crimea in our mind, and we'll have nuclear war in our mind and not in our mind in reality. So you're right. And part of our job is we have to inspire people to find their thinking again, their imagination again, which is really hard to do when you can barely survive, which is what many, many people are dealing with. Mm-hmm. They can't make ends meet. They don't know if they're going to be able to afford food or afford the rent, or you know, is the train going to break down while they're on it, or is their car going to fall apart, or whatever. So that's what I would say. I think
how to unify people under a common mission.
Well, I think when the nation has a mission for the good, people tend to come together. Like when Kennedy said, we're going to land a man on the moon in 10 years. And what happens is then suddenly you're looking for people's talents. Everyone, I hope, has seen the movie Hidden Figures, right? The space program needed these women, happened to be led by African-American women who weren't even allowed to go to certain of the engineering schools, but they said, you are brilliant. We need you in this mission. And some of the constraints or divisions evaporated. And that's why it's very important to take on bold missions that we don't have the solution for. We just know we have to get from A to B. We don't know all the things in between, but we're going to figure it out. Eradicating poverty would be such a mission. Greening the Sahara Desert would be such a mission. Refilling the Ogallala Aquifer, stopping the asteroids like Jason was saying. You know, the planet, here's another thought. We've been here, or the planet, I guess, is what, 4 or 5 billion years old or something. And in another 4 or 5 billion years, it's likely, as stars do, the sun might expand and we might all get incinerated. So would it make sense for mankind to have an idea that at least by 5 billion years from now, we should figure out either how to stop the sun from dying, maybe we can feed it or something, I don't know, or figure out a way that we can get to some other younger galaxies or younger, you know, right, exactly. But how many we don't even talk about this. I mean, I appreciate that at CPAC, I guess is where it was, Trump actually said we should build 10 new cities. It's unfortunate he thinks we should call them freedom cities, but at any rate, he had this idea of, we haven't built a new city in this country. I mean, it's crazy. And imagine what a job that would be for a bunch of second graders to say, can you design, what do you think should be in a new city? Right? That would totally change everything. Are we, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
You don't build cities because it's not allowed. If people were allowed to buy a big chunk of land and design it however they wanted to, I guarantee you a lot of people, I think Elon Musk is trying to do something like that in Austin so he can hire a lot of people. But if the people had the freedom to do that, a lot of people would be putting their money together, designing their own rail networks, how their buildings are and all that. But that it's a criminal act to do that. If you don't follow the regulations, you know, and all that, they'll tear it down. We need freedom.
Well, and you need a government that functions, because you can't, there are certain things that private companies are not going to come together and fund a national rail grid. So you have government credit. It doesn't mean the government has to own it. They don't, right? But you have to be able to direct the credit of the magnitude that's required, because your return is likely not to be overnight. And the private company says, I want to make the money in my lifetime, which might not happen, which gets back to that challenge where we have to get our government to actually, we have to take the power that we have to run the government.
It may be a better
No,
solution.
wait, I think Daniel's trying to wrap, are we trying to wrap up? Okay, go, thank you. And before we wrap up, I want to thank Daniel Burke for actually pulling this together.
Thank you to everyone watching online. Again, go to schillerinstitute.com and become a recurring member and give us lots of money, because we need it to grow a big, beautiful youth movement. And we'll see you again soon. We'll do more and bigger and better things forever after. April 15th is the Schiller Institute International Conference, a major online event. So please make sure that you sign up for that also on schillerinstitute.com. Good night. Thank you.